This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people that have so much to gain and have such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions yet.
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 211. I'm your co-host Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we are finally back from our long orchestral intermission in our series, The Land Belongs to Whom It Belongs.
Yes.
Yes, which, was that May when part 11 came out?
I think that sounds about right. I think maybe the end
months.
of May. Yeah, I feel like it was when the encampments were rolling up that I remember those last episodes coming out. But actually, in a way, it's kind of timely because now, and that really has been like a very important locus of resistance to the genocide in Gaza. That we're seeing.
Unfortunately has
campus protests, and people
not
are protesting the
abated since we
DNC
stopped.
now. And I've been seeing some really appalling videos of the sort of callous response to the protests of the DNC from people coming in and out of wherever they're holding it.
Are you referring to the lady that
pressure
was
needs to come
literally putting her fingers in her ears, running past the protesters?
Yeah, or the guy who
outside?
did a mocking impression of someone reading off the names of dead kids. That also, I think probably we might have seen the same thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Unfortunate stuff going on, and it's been a few months since we recorded the last part, but unfortunately nothing has changed except for the body count in Gaza. We're recording this on August 22nd, on the final day of the Democratic National Convention. And I think we're going to put these out kind of as we record them so as to keep them as timely as possible in these last couple of months before the election. But it's been kind of a brutal summer.
Yeah,
we're also
how many
waiting.
months has it been? I guess it's been 2 months to December and then 8 months. So it's been 10 months since this all started. This bloodthirsty, awful campaign of Israel's in Gaza. And yes, as you said, nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed maybe is the crackdown on images from Gaza that have made it onto social media in the United States and in the kind of the Anglophone world more broadly, or in general. There definitely has been, I think, an attempt to kind of crack down on that, which has been partially successful, right? If you think about it, you don't see as often, and I think part of it is exhaustion, which obviously, I encourage you, try to push through your exhaustion. Don't let this issue die, but on the other hand, one can understand, because it is truly exhausting and it's very demoralizing to see, how people do not care a lot of the time.
It's a pretty dark thing to reflect upon in American culture right now, especially in the height of, coconut brat summer, where everything is once again okay. And, watching all these optimistic speeches
and
about
also,
character and
what more do you
values.
want? She said ceasefire or something like that, where there's this kind of idea that or Kamala saying, we're working every day to get this ceasefire, or, AOC and Bernie being trotted out to say the same thing. It's you could stop it easily. Like, you don't need
Right.
to like use persuasion or beg Netanyahu. Like, you can stop what you're doing. Like, Biden gave like Israel like more money than any administration ever, I think.
Yeah.
I might be wrong about that, like, but it's an insane amount regardless, and I think it is more than any administration ever. I mean, one wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, right?
They definitely, they've stocked them well during these last 10 months, and that would be the quickest way to disrupt this genocidal machine, is to even just threaten to cut off money and weapons, which the U.S. is all too happy to do. Many Democrats are all too happy to do in all kinds of other countries and situations over the last 30, 40 years, often explicitly in the name of human rights, But we're not hearing Samantha Power or Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken or AOC or Bernie, for that matter, even, go near that with a 20-foot stick, It's
Yes.
so it's hard to not be disgusted by their cowardice and their just like uselessness as so-called progressive figures, like who were supposed to bring down the house, 5 years ago. I think we can all see clearly now how
The only
how
houses
that's
that have
played
been
out.
brought down are the houses in Gaza,
Yep,
which
pretty much.
have been was bombed into rubble. Like, that's something that I think is a shocking thing to see, like what the state of like people's homes and of like cities, in Gaza what it is like, like streets, like the sheer like volume of destruction. Of course, we know the human toll as well, and it kind of
Right.
speaks to that, like like what would become of people in this situation. But it's also just residential areas have just been like flattened.
Yeah,
So
nowhere is there. I haven't heard the phrase "responsibility to protect" yet a single time out of the Biden administration. How shocking, right?
true, yeah.
They were so about it back. We had
Well,
to
I think that
go.
they view themselves as having a responsibility to protect Israel, which
Right,
is
they are protecting. Yeah, they're
but yes.
protecting who they care about.
But anyway, our point today is not to spiral into how much we hate these people or how appalling what's happening is. We're going to resume like a historical narrative that we've been somewhat obliquely, somewhat elliptically weaving through these episodes. But I did, where we kind of left off was with sort of the end of World War I and the British conquest of Palestine, right, and kind of the end of Ottoman rule in Palestine. And the beginning of the British Mandate. So I want to get into that, but I was thinking also that kind of like I want to say serendipitously, although it was like it didn't feel like a happy accident, but maybe synchronistically with this episode. This morning you shared with me this like screed that was posted by a prominent Hollywood figure. That was kind of I think a sort of representative historical kind of narrative, or a representative historical understanding that particularly had like kind of it sort of began in this mandate period that we're going to be looking at. That
True.
I think, I think is
It's good to read. Yeah, maybe we
pretty
should read it.
illustrative. Yeah,
yeah, and also,
I think
it shows maybe, despite the fact that this guy writing is a 21st century American, it certainly shows a couple, twin British obsessions, I guess you could say, in this screed that he wrote, right?
Yes.
Because of who it's like most directly aimed at.
It's
but
very
though it's
bizarre.
about Palestine.
It's deeply, deeply strange, and like it should be qualified that like what sort of set this off was someone, he made
This is
some
well,
post.
but did we say
Okay,
who this
yeah,
was?
let's no, we didn't.
Right. Yeah. We're being quiet. No, this was
yeah.
David Simon, the epic Bacon showrunner and creator of the HBO series The Wire, which, for some period of time was considered the greatest TV show of all time. And I'm loath to give it that title today, and have not watched it since probably like 2010. But
nor have I. Yeah.
Also,
like
a big shot Hollywood creator that very highly respected, but I think also one of these guys that has just kind of utterly debased himself from like 2016 onwards on Twitter for like getting into just like fights with people. This is kind of a classic. He's sort of a classic like centrist anti-Trump guy, I think, is like what his identity sort of became after 2016.
Yeah.
But now he's unveiling a new side to his personality in, post October 7th world, which is that of
I mean, he's Mr. Reasonable, he's Mr. Both sides, Mr.
Look, like he reported on the fucking feds like for 20 years at the Baltimore Sun, blah blah blah. He respects the fucking cops, like blah blah blah.
That's kind of the framework of The Wire too. Yeah, it's like both sides, right? So that applies here. Can you imagine like the series that David Simon would write about Israel and Palestine?
Well, I have a few ideas based on this rant.
Yeah,
but maybe we should get into it.
Yeah. So we should qualify, because I think this is quite relevant. That first of all, this kind of started by him talking about Michael Collins, the IRA figure,
the Irish
right?
revolutionary hero from the World War I era. Yes.
Yeah. And he was criticized for like agreeing to the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and things like that. So he I think that this is kind of how David Simon was trying to position him as being kind of like he said something like, if only the Israelis and the Palestinians had a big fellow of their own. I guess Michael Collins was known as the big fellow or something.
He's a big boy. Yeah.
Who would come to the table, but alas, like that, so kind of being like, yeah, listen, I hate Netanyahu as much as the next guy, but these Hamas barbarian, like that type of stuff. You've seen it 1,000 times, but it's very idiosyncratic, and it definitely he unfurled. So anyway, he was challenged on this by a Twitter user who gave a very slight pushback. Nothing, didn't get personal, and it didn't get long. He just this guy just said to him, comparing the Irish struggle for freedom to Zionism is grossly offensive and comically inaccurate on so many levels. Israel has been illegally occupying Palestinian land for 50 plus years with the full support of the U.S. war machine. It meets every definition of apartheid. So, a pretty modest.
Use the A word.
Yeah, and then, so yeah, I'll just read what this guy wrote. I mean, if you can, if you want, if you feel.
No, you have it up.
Compelled. All right, I'll read it. Yeah. Okay. I know this is such
use
like
your
a
best
prima,
Long Island voice.
Yeah,
if you can.
I'll try. Yeah. Eat a bag of stale, unsalted dicks. The Irish arrogance with regard to the complexity of the Mideast history never ceases to astonish. You mooks. This is another thing where he is constantly calling people mooks. Yeah, like it's yeah. Anyway, we're warring with each other as the same people, separated by a sectarian divide for decades of bloodshed, and to this moment, you've not managed anything but a temporary two-state truce. Yet you feel assured enough to explain two distinct and wounded people, both of whom have been told by their leaders that they could vanquish the other and accept no compromise for close to a century. How peaceful coexistence is a simplicity. You know fuck all about what happened to the MUFTI in 21 and 29. I want to flag that, because this is where, the mandate period becomes important. And you can see, this is a figure who I think we'll definitely discuss during this period of our series, which is Mufti Amin al-Husseini, right? So, definitely a figure who looms very, very large in Zionist historiography of the mandate period, right? Someone
we promised we'd get to the bottom of the Grand Mufti, and we will in this movement of episodes.
Someone who's seen kind of as I think that we can certainly complicate the picture of the Mufti as he's known, right? And even the idea, in this sentence where he says, fuck all about what happened under the Mufti in 21 or 29. That is a huge, distortion, an abomination of history. Exactly. Yeah. It implies that, the Mufti was ruling Palestine or something, when really he was, a toady of, and a collaborator with, by definition, right? That was why he was appointed. We'll get into it as we go. Yeah. He wasn't, later on, I think he, his career had different phases. He started out being more conciliatory, right? And being kind of like wanting to like play both sides, kind of, like definitely serve like his British employers, right, the people who put him in that role, but also he had sympathy with the Arab cause. Later on, I think, as things started to escalate, because there was a very clear vision for what was going to happen to Palestinians, or it was obvious which way the wind was blowing. And I think, he definitely made some questionable alliances. He definitely did some questionable things and took some questionable positions, especially in hindsight. However, like, his role his power and his influence is vastly overstated. And also, like, even the positions that he had at various times were vastly overstated. And in this case, like, I think the two major distortions are, like, he's referring to, like, the Jaffa riots in 21 and in 29 the Wailing Wall, I believe, right? So yeah, like, we can talk about, like, what the actual, I think those are important events. We can talk about what actually happened in those cases, and what to what extent the Mufti was responsible. But I think the big thing is, like, that there's this kind of glossing over of what was really determinative of this time, which was that you had an occupying power, right, the British Empire, that had committed itself, not only in word, but, like, very much in deed, to, like, ushering in and midwifing a Jewish commonwealth, and viewed, basically, even though they had made promises, like, privately, right, as we talked about, and we'll
which they later denied
reiterate, and they were actually engaged. I don't know if we'll have time in this first segment, but I definitely want to talk about how they definitely knew what they were doing. They definitely meant to, like, conceal these things and to, like, betray those agreements, right? It was not like an accident or anything like that, right? But anyway, and anyway, so even though they had made these assurances, like, it was obvious that they wanted something else, and their public statements often confirm that. But anyway, so he goes on. I think it's worth reading the rest. About the road to the UN partition, about the war that ensued, about the origins of 67, and the inability of either side to contemplate a peace in which neither the Jews would be driven into the sea, another, like, meme, like, driven into the sea, or a Palestinian state could coexist with Israel. You ignore the same... So, like, what... Okay, not the inability... Okay, so, yeah, but the Israelis won't contemplate is that there could be a Palestinian state, but the Palestinians, they want Jews to be driven into the sea.
Yeah,
so
that's what he's saying.
Whatever. Anyway, you ignore the same cost to both Arab and Israeli peacemakers, Rabin or Sadat, as you herald in your Collins, and you spout rancid hyperbole such as genocide and apartheid in the name of sloganeering that leads away from serious consideration or negotiation. Apartheid? 1 out of every 5 citizens of Israel is presently not a Jew, but rather an Israeli Arab or Druze or other minority, a cohort that by polling continues to assert it would rather be Israeli citizenry than propose alternatives. By contrast, and ignored by you sloganeers, the Jewish communities of every Muslim nation across North Africa to the Near East has been, to use a phrase you shitheels employ a lot, ethnically cleansed. This is another, like, bullshit,
another
like,
trope.
Like, lie. Basically, that, like, it was ethnic cleansing and not, like, mass migration. Granted, like, certainly in the context, right, of, the post-Nakba situation, like, there certainly was, like, persecution of Jews that happened. But to say, like, this is a not
regional-wide policy of
yeah.
ethnic cleansing on purpose to send them all to Israel, I think is definitely missing the mark.
It fundamentally conflates like the idea of like people being exiled forcibly, which like in individual cases, like it may have practically been the case, but like this is and also like there was a context for that when it was the case, not to excuse it, but certainly there is a context for it, a pretty significant one. But also like this is kind of the, the Zionist line on this, which is that like, oh, it was all forced. Well, no one came like voluntarily, right? No Jews in the Middle East like wanted of their own will to go be part of the Jewish state of Israel. Kind of like a contradiction almost. Like no one actually wanted it, like they had to be forced. But also like
it is the deepest yearning of like the Jewish people throughout all history that they've always wanted. And but they just never did
wouldn't have left their
now.
homes if they weren't forced. Yeah, exactly.
It's very it doesn't really make sense the more you kind of dig into it. It's much more complex than that.
So
One anyways, is there any more?
Yeah. Oh no, it
Go
keeps going on because I think that, this really is a stark difference with like what set this off, right?
Yeah.
So he goes on about 900,000 Jews exiled in a handful of years, a coda to generations of second or third class status in Muslim regimes, given the pogroms and disenfranchisement of this minority. And here you come, only a generation into a temporary ceasefire and your own exhaustive bloodlettings, declaring for what you think is obvious and declaring what you think is obvious and practicable, for who is at fault and for who will be held blameless, despite the fact that neither side comes through this history clean and all are deeply complicit. You won't solve shit, fool. Your ass-ignorant certitude about a region and a history about which you know little. Take out the beam in your own eye here, and which you parse with your own checkered history is just another layer on the problem. I want peace and the ambitions of two wounded people secured. I've learned enough about the 20th century history of the Levant to understand how much both sides have to walk back their own frauds and denials, and how useless their sloganeering is. And I love the Irish and their history. But fuck if some of you aren't the worst pretenders to moral precision and prescription we all have to endure. What the hell?
I take umbrage. As a half-Irish podcast, we take umbrage.
Yes.
Cool it with the anti-Irish racism, David Simon.
Yes.
Who do you think you are?
It was very strange. Yeah.
It's just really going
unlike
into the
Americans
Irish.
who always have like an incredibly clear like vision of the situation in the Middle East in particular. And of their own history and
We're notorious for our morals or our moral accuracy throughout the ages. Like yikes, but a very triggered reaction. But you see the kind of like that, I mean, even between all the fuckwads and the mooks and all those kind of words, like the weaponized language that he deploys, probably some of it really like subconsciously, like he probably thinks he's being fair and direct and no bullshit, man. But you could see the sharp edges of a lot of things, that even the tiny things like under the MUFTI. Well, wait a minute, right? Like you could flag so many things, and I don't know. That's an interesting aspect of this to like dig in and deconstruct. I know you posted a lot of books in the workflowy for this, and I haven't had a chance to read all of them yet. But one that I read a good chunk of yesterday that I'm really vibing with was A Discourse on Domination and Mandate Palestine, Imperialism, Property, and Insurgency by Zeina Ghandour. And like she's fucking cooking in this book, and I think it's I don't know, there's probably a few things you want to get to, but I think it might be good to get a little bit into the way this book sets out things. Kind of like reintroduction episode today, because a huge focus of this book, it's more of like a definitely more of a theory inflected kind of theory inflected history than some of these other accounts, which are much more, they're good, but like they're very about like what happened. But she's more concerned with kind of like why did it happen, and also the kind of like material impact of the language of colonialism and imperialism, and how critical of a role it plays in the colonial project itself. That it's not just words. Like she breaks down, for example, like the writings and the letters of a few different figures, one of whom we talked about a lot in the last few ones, T.E. Lawrence, and, says that, on the one hand, it's kind of tempting to look at these wacky imperial agents and writing in their little memoirs and their letters, and these like effusive writings about like honor and like all these like British values and stuff, and kind of laugh it off as like this goofy like appendage to like the real work they were doing. But she kind of makes this, argument that
and the contemporary exactly, and the contemporary version of that is like how these people think that they learned enough about the history of the Levant from like reading like modern reformulations of the same like crap, just kind of like made to sound a bit more like quote unquote objective. But anyway, sorry, yeah, continue.
Yeah. So I mean, this book is kind of described as like an unwriting of the history of previous histories of the British Mandate period. And yeah, the introduction here, this is not ethnography, unwriting Palestine, because I think she argues pretty convincingly that we do have to like unpack a lot of these older sources that, covered this even in great detail. Oftentimes, like, certain terminologies get kind of like smuggled in, or they're not interrogated, that really do come from like the fount of like, the British imperialists themselves, and thus are ideologically loaded, right? And they have a certain sinister purpose in creating like the I don't know, like the overall colonial dynamics of the British Mandate. Yeah, she says here in the introduction, maybe just give a little flavor about this kind of approach that I like. She says that the story of Mandate Palestine is plagued by ambiguities, double, triple, quadruple deals, irreconcilable promises, an indeterminate moral compass, improvisational strategy, intense diplomacy, but no real implementation plan, the chaotic introduction and suspension of laws, regulations, and customs, the classification, eradication of native culture, amidst all of which, as a result of an ideological, political, economic, and linguistic blitz, the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multicultural region was gradually transformed to replicate, and is now fully reminiscent of, an ancient struggle between two Abrahamic tribes, the sons of Isaac and those of Ishmael, his brother from another mother. There is a major body of literature on Mandate Palestine in the tradition of linear historical narrative. In this tradition, each account will typically rely on its own accumulation of facts to support a particular political incline, be it pro-Arab, pro-Zionist, or apologist for empire. But this literature is more homogeneous than might appear at first glance. Its component parts have become embroiled, helplessly drawn into the compelling catastrophe as it unfolded, and routinely fall back on the adversarial antagonism which developed between Palestine natives and immigrants, or, quote, Arabs and, quote, Jews, as they have come to be known, in order to tell and countertell how a homeland was, quote, lost and, quote, won. But what those types of historical accounts of Mandate Palestine habitually and persistently disregard in favor of the drama of the escalating nationalist conflict, of mounting Zionist desperation in the face of Jewish persecution in Europe, of mounting Arab desperation in the face of disenfranchisement and Zionist encroachment, is the nature of British colonial aspirations, which loomed larger than, whilst alternately prodding and suppressing both Zionist and Palestinian national ambitions. In relation to the latter, make that asphyxiate. This is manifest in the official British discourse of the period, and to an even greater extent within unofficial discourse, conversation, which focused always on the consolidation rather than on the devolution of power over there. The ambitions and character of British rule were clearly and explicitly enunciated at the onset of the occupation of Palestine, in relation, for instance, to the best techniques with which to rule natives in the generic sense, / Easterners, Muslims, to the historical place of Great Britain in the biblically inspired restoration of the Jews to Palestine, and to the fundamental rights and responsibilities of the worldwide imperial enterprise. Yet they have gradually faded into the background and out of the frame of historical studies of Mandate Palestine. That the empire existed before and beyond native or settler is a stubborn but dimly lit fact. So just a little more here. British discourse during the Mandate, then, with its unremitting convergence on the problematic of the native question, and which rested on racial and cultural theories and presumptions, as well as on certain givens drawn from the British class system, has been taken for granted by subsequent historians. The validity of cultural representations as pronounced within official correspondence and colonial laws and regulations, as well as within the private papers of colonial officials, survives more or less intact. There are features of colonialism additional to economic and political power. There are features of colonial rule in Palestine which are glaring yet have escaped examination, which carried cultural weight and had cultural implications, and which negatively transformed native society. This was inevitable. But what is less inevitable is the subsequent collusion of historians in this, a parentheses, neo-colonial dynamic. The continued collusion of modern historians with racial and cultural notions concerning the rationale of European rule over there has post-colonial implications. It drags these old notions into the present, where their iniquitous barbarity continues to manifest. Histories of Mandate Palestine written by historians, even if they're well-meaning ones, even if they seem impartial, focus on big events and rely on certain preconceived notions. These notions are themselves drawn from explicit musings within the official documents of the National Archives of Britain and Israel, and they lend themselves to crude and sketchy summarization. Palestinians rioted regularly.
Right.
Their farming methods were primitive and inefficient, and were in dire need of improvement and modernization. Their land law, a scenic Ottoman relic, was a mess, nothing an overhaul could not fix. Anti-British activity was the work of criminals. Armed resistance was banditry. Guerrillas were desperados. Peasants lacked a coherent political consciousness and were incapable of political action beyond a knee-jerk defense of their own little patch of land. They were only worth discussing when they posed a threat to law and order. They were clannish and volatile. Religion, parentheses, one in particular, could really get them going. Political leaders from the towns and cities were parochial and motivated by kinship ties rather than ideas. A biblical backdrop, a primordial people. The rest is history? ? Oh, okay. So, this is so I guess she states her intention here. The last thing I'll read. I hope in this work, I hope not so much to rewrite Mandate Palestine or any aspect of it as to undo or dismantle the scaffolding on which Mandate histories are mounted, or awkwardly to unwrite. So, yeah. And, she also says here, I like this line, the empire struck with discourse, and it is possible to discourse directly back. Discourse sugarcoats violence. It is discourse rather than the big events, and as a prerequisite to the big events, which influenced, molded, and manipulated political reality in Mandate Palestine. A discourse appealing to the desirability of uplifting social evolution via the technology of benevolent colonial rule and industrial capitalism was deployed mercilessly and aggressively. British rule was justified based on an organization and enunciation of culturally nuanced knowledge. Yeah, that's a really great point, right?
Yes, definitely. And you really can see how you can definitely see how the way that people talk about it, even the example that we just read, it corresponds so much with what she's talking about. Isn't
it interesting that David Simon did not mention Britain a single time during that big rant about the Mandate and the MUFTI and everything else?
Yeah,
he did,
exactly.
It proves her point, right?
Absolutely.
The invisibility of the British.
Yes.
In all of this.
Yeah, and the whole focus on what happened in 21 and 29, right? This kind of riot-focused historiography, right?
Yeah,
because
they riot.
Obviously that's what colonial administrators were most upset about, right? And most concerned about, right? Stopping this from happening,
Is this is kind of a classic the map is not the territory kind of moment, right? That just because you're reading imperial agents' correspondence doesn't mean that you're getting a well-rounded full view of what was actually happening there, you know, and also not from a very specific perspective. The idea that you're getting a universal disinterested kind of narration of what happened. It's of course, imperial agents are going to be concerned with law and order and disorder and things of that nature disproportionately, right? And have a certain view about it.
Yes, and this actually, this is important because it kind of feeds into something, what I was talking about before, right? The destruction of infrastructure that we see in Gaza and, in Palestine in general over the course of the last 50 years, really, or 50 plus years, since the creation of the State of Israel. Almost 70 years, right? More. So this, I think, wasn't it recently the 75th anniversary, right, of the Declaration?
Last year would have been 75th. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think this, it really feeds into what's been happening, which is in a way a kind of epistemicide, right? It's a knowledge killing and the destruction of archives, the destruction of information, right? And the actual physical demolition of like alternative narratives, right? Like there's another article that I wanted to read, and I think was good to kind of like set the tone around the importance of the mandate period for getting into some other stuff. It's by Lauren Banco. It's called Occupational Hazards Revisited, Palestinian Historiography. And I guess it's a kind of a sequel to an article by an anthropologist, Ted Swedenborg, who wrote, I guess, 23 years ago from the time of this article's publication. I guess he wrote that in 1989, so this article is summer 2012. But he talks about the problems of ethnographic research in the occupied West Bank. All right, so now she's talking about the difficulties of historiography of Palestine, right? So from 1989 until now in 2012, the situation that researchers in the occupied territories face has changed drastically. The methods of control used by Israel in the occupied territories in East Jerusalem are different. The resistance to the now 45-year-old occupation has changed. The security situation on both sides has been radically transformed. For example, the massive concrete separation wall, which did not exist in the 1980s, and 2 life-altering intifadas have taken place. It is very difficult for researchers to travel to and work in the Gaza Strip due to the ongoing blockade of the territory by Israel. Although with the changes to the government in Egypt, it is easier to enter Gaza from Rafah Crossing, one must have permission from the Israeli government to enter the Gaza Strip through Erez Crossing. At times, Israel only permits entry to individuals who are employed with international organizations in Gaza. Funding bodies often do not finance researchers traveling to areas that governments advise against travel within. Finally, the means of acquiring and disseminating information in 2012 are worlds away from what they were in the 1980s. My own research situation is much different from Swedenborg's. Although the occupational hazards of any type of research in this location remain at their core the same, those of us who work as historians research and acquire our information in a different way than anthropologists and ethnographers like Swedenborg. My research and the previous work of Swedenborg both analyze and discuss identity during the period of the British Mandate among non-elite Palestinian Arabs. Swedenborg found much of his material by speaking with Palestinians who were alive during the Mandate and those who fought against the British in the revolt of 1936 and 1939. By which we'll talk about much later. We'll stay. I think we're still kind of in the 20s
opening
for now.
Yeah,
but,
if that
like,
kind of the establishment of the mandate.
Yeah. By 2011, when I did my field work, this type of historical information gathering on the Palestine Mandate, oral histories, is all but impossible, as many of the individuals Swedenborg spoke with are either no longer living or no longer able to tell their stories. My work was and is entirely based on documentary sources. The documentary sources within Israeli and Palestinian archives by their nature do not negate any of the problems posed by oral histories and collective memories of the Mandate period. As Bashara Dumani explains, Palestinian archives are authorizing discursive fields that naturalize some stories about the past and by implication silence others. With the continued popularity of the rise of Palestinian nationalism in the historiographical narrative, Dumani rightly points out that some individuals use archives with the purpose of affirming their idea of what Palestinian society was before 1948 and seeking ways to show ties that connect Palestinians to their land and the national movement. Nationalism does indeed have a pronounced effect on archives, especially those of a nation whose nationalism has been unsuccessful in leading to the creation of a sovereign state. Quite often, the methodological problem of research in the discipline of history stem from issues with the sources themselves rather than the ways in which the quote-unquote real world impacts academic research. Historical research of the Palestine Mandate period is impacted by both source material problems and the current real-world conflict that poses significant obstacles for historians who attempt to use a broad range of archives. It cannot be denied that a great many historical narratives of Palestine and the State of Israel have been researched and written not as pure scholarly pieces of work, but rather to fit into one of the two national narratives. It seems that instances of this approach have been detrimental to historians who hope to carry out academic historical investigations of the British Mandate over Palestine from 1920 to 1948. Both official and personal documentary archives have been routinely and impulsively looted and destroyed in the period after 1948 until today. Access has been denied to certain archives, others are impossible to locate, and of course some are impossible to reach for certain individuals depending on their passport or national identity. A major problem with historiography of the Mandate and post-1948 period being part of a nationalist project is that it is difficult to challenge or add to the existing historiography. The most glaring example of this is the suppression of certain nationalist or non-nationalist voices on both sides, both the Palestinian Arab historiography and that of the Jewish immigrants and Zionist movement during the Mandate period. To use certain archives of the Palestinian national movement to their fullest, it is impossible not to see many Arabic documents that express support for the Zionist project and Jewish immigration, and those that are vehemently against certain, quote, nationalist figures in the Arab executive and Arab Higher Committee. It is true that these opinions, written and signed by villagers and urbanites alike, are part of the Palestinian Arab heritage, and the history of all voices in the Mandate should be included in narratives of that particular period. However, for a Palestinian historian or historian whose work contributes to the Palestinian historiography, including this type of history is tantamount to not being an objective historian, but rather often being labeled as an Israeli apologist. Historians of Palestine and Israel face the threat of their work being dismissed as pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. The primary existing framework of the history of the Mandate is that of nationalism, and many archives and sources stress this. What the framework does not contribute to is the diversity and nuances of the nationalist movement, including populist leaders or those leaders and members of the movement who were deemed too radical or too conciliatory. Therefore, it is difficult to write a historical narrative of the Palestine Mandate without focusing on nationalism. For instance, Leila Khalili writes that in Israel and Palestine especially, a researcher must take into account the way political atmosphere and both structures and underwrites the representation of his or her research material. Access to a wide variety of colonial archival sources is necessary. This is true for my own research in the creation of and the discourses and practices surrounding Palestinian nationality and citizenship legislation and citizenship rights during the first 2 decades of the British administration of the Mandate. As part of this, the British legislative side is historicized along with the Palestinian populist discourses and practices of nationality and citizenship. Nationalism was, of course, part of this study in the context of what the concept of citizenship meant to the Palestinians who identified as part of the national movement, but nationality and citizenship are just terms that must be studied from as many angles as possible in order to give justice to their place in the historical narrative not only of Palestine, but also of Britain, and of the post-war period of internationalism and the rise of documentary identity of the nation-state. Yeah, and she goes on to talk about, some of the obstacles that you face, coming into Palestine to do research. She talks about this as something that has been consistently true, right? Another part of Swedenborg's experience that still rings true is that foreign researchers in the West Bank go through nothing compared with what the Palestinians are subjected to. The daily humiliation, home raids and demolitions, arrests, kidnappings of children, interrogations, beatings, the inability to travel without necessary permits, and much more. Despite the solidarity we may feel with Palestinians in the anti-occupation struggle, we foreigners are still immune to an incredible lot of horrors simply because we hold foreign passports rather than a huwiyah, the Palestinian identity card issued by Israel. Most foreign academics in Palestine choose to regulate their expression of solidarity in a less overt fashion, since no valid sponsorship, in terms of an Israeli visa, exists for historians who research or teach in the occupied territories. Most foreign NGO and private sector workers deal with the same problem. To tell the border guards at Ben Gurion Airport or on the Allenby Bridge crossing that you plan to enter and live in the West Bank to study Arabic or work is a red flag in the eyes of the state of Israel and will in many cases warrant a denial of entrance. Researchers can only obtain a special visa to be in Israel if they are registered as students in an Israeli university. Instead, most of us work with our 3-month tourist visas and leave the country after 90 days. Crossing our fingers when we try to enter again, we will be given a new 3-month visa. To give away too much information about researching in the West Bank is to risk not being allowed to enter Israel to research at all. All right, so...
Damn. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's worth keeping in mind.
Yes, definitely something worth keeping in mind, right?
Historians don't just have the golden key to unlock the vast universal library where you can look at all evidence just perfectly balanced. There are these bottlenecks and shit gets gatekept, right?
Yeah, it's almost like that, Chomsky thing. I hate to invoke Chomsky, but I think and many people have formulated the same idea. But it's I think he's kind of in an interview with someone, some news talking head, and he says the guy says well, are you saying that I have to take a certain position in order to have the job that I have? And Chomsky's I'm saying that if you didn't hold that position, then you wouldn't have the job that you have. So I remember that. Something like that. But the people who get access to these archives, right? And she talks about how there are some that exists in Palestine, right? And maybe there is an incentive to adopt kind of a nationalist framework, right? And to consider your work in a certain way, right? We talked about sort of the complex genesis of Palestinian nationalism, and this is a period where it's liminal, right? We read a lot from an earlier part, Antoninus's book, right? And one of the things that Antonius really like kind of exaggerates is like the support for Arab nationalism, right? We looked at some other sources that kind of challenge that, where there was a lot of, and maybe if we have time, we can look at it, in another article that kind of discusses this, but there was a lot of like lingering desire for, certainly relative to the British mandate, lingering desire for the Ottomans to take over, especially after, the Turkish, victories, right, in Anatolia, right, the sort of
right,
the Turkish
and Antonio is kind of like as an Arab nationalist,
he
downplays
hates
that.
right, like so. This sort of narrative, as we talked about before, this narrative of like the doom and gloom of the Ottoman period, kind of was something that became part of like nationalist historiography.
Well, remember, David Simon just casually mentioning like generations of pogroms in the Ottoman Empire. It's like, no, bro, that was Russia. That was in Europe. Like, not to say there was like never ever a pogrom, but the
whole idea that like of like Jewish oppression under Islamic domination is again like a Zionist talking point that's completely like fabricated. And like if you like again, like obviously minorities have been basically persecuted anywhere. Religious minorities, ethnic minorities, like they've always faced discrimination and persecution, and those things like were like worse in pre-modernity and in early modernity, right? And like but like generally speaking, like Jews definitely had it better in like Muslim polities and in areas like where Islam was the majority religion than they did in Christian Europe. It's absolutely just like recognized by everybody.
Close.
Recognized by everybody. So, but again, this kind of thing of like, they were constantly under
classic
like, the
TV
yoke.
writer. He's trying to retcon something back in and like transpose these two histories of like the Pale of Settlement, like pogroms and like state-sponsored anti-Jewish violence in the Russian Empire in the late 1800s, and I guess also the Inquisition, which was actually Catholics taking back land from Muslims and then like burning a bunch of Jews as witches and shit like that, right? I mean, that's generally the context of the Spanish Inquisition, right? And the Reconquista. So he's just got his history all fucking ass backwards and is just throwing it in there. Now, I mean, because he specifically, he's not just talking about this kind of post-1948 period where, maybe you can say to some extent that there was definitely some like frictions, there was some eruptions of violence and some persecution across like a lot of the former territories of the Ottoman Empire, but you can't quite separate that from the occurrence of the Nakba itself and the appearance of Israel as a nation state sponsored by the European powers. Like, he's trying to make a point that Israel had to be, or he's implying that it had to be created because, Europe was bad, but also in this whole region, which used to be Ottoman, there were he just implies that they're kind of like pogroms. There was just horrible oppression. It was so bad. And so I guess by implication, the British came to liberate, the 5% of Jews that did live in Palestine, and then bring the other oppressed Jews who are oppressed in a different region also there. And then like, it all breaks down. Like it actually it's very ahistorical and doesn't make sense, but people will just say these things confidently. And that's when false history or history can become like a dagger and do real damage. Like, in the hands of mooks like David Simon,
yes,
throwing things fast and loose around there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, this kind of idea. Yeah, I think that what you said about the invisibility of the British is incredibly relevant in that situation. But yeah, I mean, that did become cemented. I mean, you can see it in Antonius, right, who we read from so much last time, right? He was kind of just upset that the British hadn't kept their promises, right, and like the McMahon correspondence and all of that stuff, right? And if they had, then maybe it would have been different. But that wasn't necessarily how everyone saw it, right? This sort of nationalism took place really in response to this like a sort of feeling of being under siege, which they absolutely were, right, by the sort of a Zionist project, right, which is midwifed by the British administration, right? But and of course, like a lot of these archives, like also, as we talked about, like they've been sort of pillaged and destroyed, right, by by Israel, like as a policy, right? So we basically end up left with people who are using these, like British colonial documents to write this time, right? Like Israel has a wartime history of looting intellectual property with the removal of books, documents, and other archival materials from Palestinian libraries and homes, not only in Jerusalem, but also in Lebanon. Jerusalem was a center of libraries of private individuals and public and educational institutions during the Ottoman and Mandate periods, but the city's libraries and personal homes have been looted, and works such as personal memoirs and collections have been removed by Israeli military authorities and transferred to Israel proper or destroyed.
Damn.
In 1948,
so they take this shit real seriously.
They do. Yeah, they know what they're doing too. Like they do it.
Right.
Like it's
Yeah. That's not just a silly, like
Yeah.
overly vigilant thing they did. That was cunning and smart to. Yeah, I mean, because then the like sort of like the epistemic authority of the historian rests upon the primary sources you're able to discover and like riff on, right?
Yes.
And if you can't discover those primary sources because they've been hidden away and are in some secret Israeli military archive somewhere, never to be seen again, or only seen by like pro-Zionist historians who can, spin them a certain way, etc. Like you could see easily that's a weapon in the kind of arsenal of the colonial power.
Yes. Speaking of, and kind of on that point, I think it might be. Yeah, maybe this is relevant. I'm trying to think.
Well, I'll say as you're looking for that, I'll just read another banger line from Discourse on Domination, where she says. She actually talks about colonial archives and says, for British cultural domination comprises more than the obvious inferiorizing, exoticizing, and reifying aspects of Oriental culture. It is a phenomenon which manifests in seemingly benign and innocuous language, the introduction of conceptual basics such as Jews and non-Jews, Muslims and migrants, communities and development, national home and nation state, self-determination and autonomy, extremists and moderates, private and public, religious and secular, is one which has been taken for granted by historians as simply grasping and reflecting cultural realities, but which, on the contrary, is deeply suggestive, fundamentally flawed, irrecuperably partial, and has contributed to the creation of novel/foreign binary oppositions and ditto cultural realities. The linguistic domination of Mandate Palestine is an acceptable fact which has somehow been achieved outside time and outside history, and what remains at stake amongst waylaid historians is the physical manifestation of this domination and the techniques with which it was implemented. So histories which at first might seem to diverge irreconcilably in terms of style, allegiances, and focus, nonetheless conspire in two crucial ways. First, by uncritically prioritizing the methodology of the discipline of history, and second, by adopting, again uncritically, the weighted language of the British Mandatory. We know that the colonial archive is a deeply tinged source, which taints scholarship that draws on it when its contents are taken as comprehensive and absolute. However, it is also a rich, multi-layered source, which contains indicators and markers and glimpses of an alternative history. The colonial archive is capable of generating an entirely dissident reading and writing of history. For the mischievous like me, it really can be the gift that keeps on giving. So yeah, I think that's spot on too, and I think that's kind of what we want to do is, even reading through these colonial sources, like it is possible to sort of read between the lines in a different way and then generate a very different kind of alternative history or conclusion from them, right?
Yes. And I mean, you kind of had to look into like obscure places and a lot of like different discourses kind of keep it together, or a lot of kind of from the off the beaten path sources, which I feel like we've done previously in some of the things we've looked at about in talking about the Ottoman period. Like I have some articles here. I'm not sure if we'll be able to talk about them this time, but there's some great articles I found about like and I think this is kind of relevant to what we've talked about recently on SJ in terms of like child's play, right? Talking about like the sort of toys that like the patriotic games and the British Mandate that children were encouraged with, or history education. The way that like school teachers were now being like instructed or kind of strong-armed to teaching history, sometimes like a narrative that was like completely like alien to Arab Palestinians who had been teaching prior to the Mandate, right? Yeah, like for instance, at the height of the Arab Revolt in 1936 and 1939, a little bit later than talking about now, H.M. Wilson, an Englishwoman who taught at the independent Birzeit School, reflected on the intense nationalist sentiment that animated her classroom. Every single English lesson worked around some way to the rebellion, or would have done if we had let it. I fell into the habit of being prepared for even Tipping's higher English grammar to pop up with some remark on subjunctives or participles, which could be twisted into an allusion to the Arab cause. Right. And so this is kind of this like you had this kind of colonial schooling that's trying to discipline these children who apparently are trying to rebel even in their grammar lessons.
Wow.
So this is something that is a significant shift. It might actually be good. Like we had talked about, like we read the Balfour Declaration, sort of short but shocking document. We read from Sykes-Picot. Might be good before we get into other stuff. It might be good to read the
Mandate itself.
The Mandate itself, yeah.
Yeah. Which was this in 1920? This was finalized in 1922, right? But yeah, we could read the thing itself. Did you have any good sources on like the origins of the Mandate in terms of like overviews, just to situate us, like in terms of, because it took a few years to like actually, the British were occupying.
There was San Remo and stuff like that. Yeah, that's true.
There were some conferences, but we could just read the Mandate, which was ratified by the League of Nations, right, in 1922.
We can read also like I think I do want to read from this book a little bit, Policy of Deceit.
I read some of that. That was good.
Some of that. Yeah, word. We could. Well, I was thinking we could start like at chapter 3. Maybe we can read a little before that to give some context for the development of the Mandate. But we can. I think it might be good to kind of read the document itself to kind of situate what was going on here. Okay. So the Council of the League of Nations says, whereas the principal Allied powers have agreed, for the purpose of giving effect to the provisions of Article 2 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, to entrust a mandatory selected by the said powers to the administration of the territory of Palestine, which formerly belonged to the Turkish Empire, within such boundaries as may be fixed by them, and whereas the principal Allied powers have also agreed the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917, by the government of His Britannic Majesty, and adopted by the said powers, in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, and whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country, and whereas the principal Allied powers have selected His Britannic Majesty as the mandatory for Palestine, and whereas the mandate in respect of Palestine has been formulated in the following terms and submitted to the Council for the League of the League for approval, and whereas His Britannic Majesty has accepted the mandate in respect of Palestine and undertaken to exercise it on behalf of the League of Nations in conformity with the following provisions, and whereas by the aforementioned Article 22, paragraph 8, it is provided that the degree of authority, control, or administration to be exercised by the mandatory, not having been previously agreed upon by the members of the League, shall be explicitly defined by the Council of the League of Nations. Confirming the said mandate defines its terms as follows. So, there's a couple different articles here. Article 1, the mandatory shall have full powers of legislation and administration, save as they may be limited by terms of this mandate. Article 2, the mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home, as laid down in the preamble, and the development of self-governing institutions, and also for safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. The mandatory shall, so far as circumstances permit, encourage local autonomy. Article 4, an appropriate Jewish agency shall be recognized as a public body for the purpose of advising and cooperating with the administration of Palestine on such economic, social, and other matters as may affect the establishment of the Jewish national home and the interests of the Jewish population in Palestine, and subject always to the control of the administration to assist and take part in the development of the country. The Zionist organization, so long as its organization and constitution are in the opinion of the mandatory appropriate, shall be recognized as such agency. It shall take steps in consultation with His Britannic Majesty's government to secure the cooperation of all Jews who are willing to assist in the establishment of the Jewish national home. So you can already see, the writing on the wall.
Yeah,
for people who are still a small minority of the population of Palestine at this point.
I think is it still at 6% at the end of World War I?
I think it's 7%.
7%. Yeah, it's gone up, but there's a few tens of thousands of mostly some German Zionists and then Russian Jewish Zionists that have moved there, but still a pretty small and actually might still be smaller than the original Jewish population, which was 4%, right? Of basically the so-called later called Mizrahi Jews, who had actually been living there, but in peace, more or less, in not under extreme persecution under the Ottoman Empire, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So can definitely see where this is going. The Article 3 is pretty funny. The mandatory shall, so far as circumstances permit, encourage local autonomy.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah, I actually did. I even read Article 3. I think I skipped to Article 4 because it was so small. Maybe I did read it, but or
maybe you did. Yeah. But,
right. Yeah.
So then, Article 5 is pretty clear. The mandatory shall be responsible for seeing that no Palestine territory shall be ceded or leased to or in any way placed under the control of the government of any foreign power. So it. Hands off everybody else. It's British protected territory. And then, it starts to get a little more explicit after that. Article 6, the administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions and shall encourage, in cooperation with the Jewish agency referred to in Article 4, which is the Zionist organization, close settlement by Jews in the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes. And I can only imagine how much the definition of wastelands was probably stretched.
Yes.
Right? I can only imagine. Oldest trick in the book. I had another random thought, while I was reading some of this stuff last night, and the propensity, I think, then this Discourse and Domination book definitely calls out the language, and we called it out, I think, back in our maybe part 3, talking about Mark Twain's descriptions of the Holy Land, of it kind of being abandoned and uncultivated and devoid of people. And obviously this is an imperialist kind of trick, but also to think about the dawn of the British Mandate period and the first huge waves of European Jewish immigration to Palestine. Another thing I don't see pointed out that, because maybe people perceived it that way when they arrived, but as we went over during World War I, there was a horrible famine and World War
Yes.
One happened there, and all this other shit, and like society had sort of collapsed, like in a very total way. So in a way, it's kind of like, oh no shit, everything looked like fucked up when you got there, like it, you know what I mean? And then like the Ottoman Empire collapsed after that, but of course, that's like that doesn't mean that like people weren't living there, or I think those circumstances were then kind of like manipulated into like, oh look, they can't like cultivate the land, they can't like take care of it, like we need to like guide them, right? Like look how broken down everything is. And it's like, well,
Yes.
that's what happens in war. Like France also looked fucked up, like it's a lot of places looked fucked up after World War One, and Palestine got hit particularly hard with like their famine and the locusts and everything else, right?
Yes, I mean, they definitely would have said that like anyway, but I mean, yeah, fair enough. Like it, may have
Just in case anybody pulls out a diary and like somebody like got off a boat and said like, I saw with my own eyes, it all looked like all the cattle were dead and blah blah blah, and then like they try to use that as justification to like basically back up the British argument. No, like they would have said it either way. I don't think it would have. I mean, they were saying it in the 19th century, right? When it's clear there were people cultivating land, and it was not as kind of portrayed by a lot of like foreign sources that were just like, oh, it's so like back. It's just like 2,000 years ago. Like it's so. Was it relatively underdeveloped compared to other parts of the Ottoman Empire? Like, sure, but like, so was a lot of Europe. Like, it's like a ridiculous argument.
Yeah, like there's this quote that I flagged in that book, Policy of Deceit, from this guy Lord Cromer, who would govern Egypt in the late 19th century. I don't know if you saw this. He's
profiled in this book.
Yeah. My lords, what are the essential facts of the case? Palestine was conquered by one of the most brilliant campaigns of which we have any knowledge in our annals. We found in 1917 a country which, owing to the long and pestilential blight of Turkish administration, had become depopulated, impoverished, and relatively poor. Whatever your views about the potential and resources of the country, there cannot be any doubt that Palestine is a country where there is scope for more people, for more scientific cultivation, for the construction of more railways, for better sanitation, for afforestation on a more scientific scale, and for development of all the resources of the country, whether great or small. Where is that development to come from? The Turks were quite incapable of doing it. The Arabs are equally incapable. There is no friend of the Arabs who will claim that they have the resources, wealth, or energy to do it at a scale which, at any rate, we should like to see it done. It was in these circumstances that an opportunity was afforded to the Jews to undertake this task in their old home.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he just like forecloses on every other group because he's like extremely racist. And I think he was like anti-Jewish as well. But, one of these British guys that ended up thinking Zionism was a neat idea.
As anti-Jewish as he may have been, he certainly thought they had more energy than the Arabs. Leaving aside resources and wealth. They
were European adjacent enough that,
in many cases, in terms of the people immigrating at this time, like literally they were European. So, yeah.
Right. But, I mean, without getting too much in the weeds of like what is nationality, it's still like functionally speaking.
Well, insofar as there are people coming from Europe. In many cases at this time, like a lot of the immigration was, but yeah. So anyway, you can kind of see like what's going, and that's kind of the reason why this mandate didn't go over super well with everybody, right? And a lot of people there were definitely instances of people, calling for even, not only the the return of the Ottoman rule, right, but also they were hoping maybe that even Ataturk maybe would take the reins, right, and would help them rather than as an alternative to Britain, right. There's this article liminal loyalties, Ottomanism and Palestinian responses to the Turkish War of Independence, right? He talks about some of this early support. In fact, like even among some of these figures who would become somewhat significant later on, like the Husseini family. But maybe I'll read from some of this. Hold on, let me see if I can find. So, the Kemalist victory over the Greeks in September 1922 and the armistice the following month inspired Palestinians to speculate on the possibility of an impending Turkish military liberation of Palestine. The Turkish-British dispute over the status of Mosul led to suggestions that the Turks would liberate Iraq and then Palestine. On 3rd October 1922, Philistine, in an article titled Turkish Victories Frighten Jews Over Palestine, reported that the Jewish Chronicle had raised the question of whether Great Britain would intervene to prevent a Turkish move on Mosul. Philistine further speculated if, should Turkey capture Iraq, England would oppose attempts to be forcibly expelled from Palestine, intimating a Turkish military assault on Palestine. The Jewish people are not ignorant of the possibility, the Jaffa Daily noted, which worried them. More realistically, the opening of the Lausanne Conference to renegotiate the Treaty of Sèvres, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Sèvres, presented the possibility of Turkish diplomatic and political support for the Palestinian cause. In the eyes of the Palestinian leadership, Sèvres was the only legal basis for the British Mandate, approved by the League of Nations in July 1922. Palestinians reasoned that if Sèvres, which had put the Ottoman Arab provinces under European control, was to be renegotiated, then Palestine's future could be revisited, or it would inevitably be revisited. The Arab executive therefore sought a voice at Lausanne and Turkish diplomatic support there, sending a delegation to Istanbul and Lausanne in November 1922. Despite Kemalist rhetorical support for Arab self-determination as expressed in Article 1 of the National Pact and Turkish popularity among Palestinians in the wake of the Kemalist victories, there were tensions between the two sides. Some Kemalists resented Arabs for the wartime Arab revolt. In October 1922, an editorial in Lisan al-Arab claimed that Kemal, or someone close to him, had said, "You Arabs should not think we forgot the treachery you committed against us." Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Muzaffar, again, like kind of everyone is sort of exaggerating this, the popularity of this, which really wasn't very much, but they certainly, at that time, and we can see this as it goes on, like this stab in the back type of thing was very popular, especially among people like Ataturk. So anyway, Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Muzaffar, who would be the main contact between the Arab executive and the Turks, responded in Philistine, challenging Lisan al-Arab to provide more information on the quotation's provenance, so we could repudiate this fabricated incident and lie. Some Palestinian national leaders had reason to doubt the Turkish commitment to Arab self-determination and Muslim solidarity. When the Palestinian delegation in London wrote to the Indian Khilafatists in May 1922, seeking the latter's support, the occasion had been a rumor that the Turks consented to the French occupation of Islamic Syria and would surrender control of Holy Palestine to the Zionists. The Palestinians sarcastically questioned how such a stand could come from a government that claimed to be the foundation of the caliphate, predicted the decision would be met with outrage throughout the Islamic world, and accused Ankara of abandoning Al-Haram al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the sacred Al-Aqsa Mosque, the first Qibla and third noble sanctuary. Despite these mutual suspicions, the Arab executive appointed a delegation comprising Musa Kazim al-Husseini, Amin al-Tamimi, and Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Muzaffar to travel to Istanbul and Lausanne. Upon the delegation's departure from Gaza, Abdul Qadir al-Muzaffar addressed a crowd of 400 to 500 supporters with the grandiose promise of what Lausanne held for Palestinians, stating, "We shall meet Mustafa Kemal Pasha. We shall meet the Turks. We shall meet the Muslim world at large. We shall return with complete independence under the Turkish mandate and with the Balfour Declaration repealed," and called out, "Down with Zionism, the elections, and the Legislative Council." And the author notes that the phrase, "we shall meet the Turks," he actually repeated it 3 times. So it's like, we shall meet the Turks. We shall meet the Turks. Yeah, it was very, and that was, I guess, rousing up the crowd. Arriving in Istanbul on the 14th November 1922, the delegation met with Rafat Pasha, the governor of Istanbul, who promised that the Turks would insist that Article 1 of the National Pact, Arab self-determination, be applied to Palestine. Leaving behind al-Muzaffar to continue soliciting Turkish support, al-Husseini and Tamimi departed for Lausanne, where they were joined by Shibli al-Jamal. Abdul Qadir al-Muzaffar was delegated to remain in Turkey because of his defense of the Kemalists and because of the many ties he had forged with the Turks throughout his service as a religious functionary in the Ottoman army and his political activism in Syria from 1918 to 1920. Despite meeting delegates to the Grand National Assembly, writers and jurists, some of whom wrote newspaper articles in favor of Palestinian demands, al-Muzaffar departed less enthusiastic, suspecting Turkish aims that the conference would trump Arab needs, compelling him to cut short his stay and forego traveling to Ankara as he had intended. Meanwhile, in Lausanne, the Palestinian delegation met with Ismet Pasha, head of the Turkish delegation. At the first meeting, Ismet promised that Turkey would insist upon the Arabs' right of self-determination and even said that the Palestinian delegation should be permitted to address the conference. But Ismet evaded subsequent meetings with the Palestinians, and other members of the Turkish delegation made clear the Turks' intention to accept the post-World War I status quo and Article 95 of the Treaty of Sèvres, which authorized a mandate for Palestine incorporating the Balfour Declaration. The Arab executive downplayed this tepid Turkish response, highlighting instead the most positive statements. On his return to Palestine in December 1922, Abdulkadir al-Muzaffar recounted his fruitful meetings with Turkish officials, conveying Mustafa Kemal's greetings to all Palestinians and his promise not to forsake them in the struggle for independence. In a speech, al-Muzaffar quoted the response the Turkish foreign minister gave to those who doubted Turkish commitment to Palestine. "You have annoyed us with Palestine. We have already a huge dossier about it. We often are interrupted in our most important meetings at the parliament by a wire from the king of Afghanistan, Shah of Persia, Raja. These wires and protests are then discussed and raise the fanaticism of the Anatolian sheikhs, who start crying and urging us to help Palestine and to protect Masjid al-Aqsa and the Haram. We have a great difficulty in convincing these people we are helping and will help Palestine." When asked if Turkey would ratify a treaty recognizing the mandates and in defiance of its pledge to support Arab self-determination, al-Muzaffar reassured his audience the Turks will never do it or they will never do it willingly. He urged the population to love the Turks. They are our brethren in Islam, our neighbors, and it is our benefit to be on good terms with them. It was not just the Husseini-controlled Arab executive that saw a Turkish solution to the Palestine question, but also Palestinian notables hostile to the Husseinis' dominance. Philistine published a letter calling for a Turkish mandate over Palestine whose signatories referred to themselves as the People of Jerusalem. Addressed to Mustafa Pasha Kemal, the president of the Lausanne Conference, although he did not serve in this capacity, and to Ismet Pasha, the petition demanded the full independence of Palestine under a mandate of the Turkish Kemalist government. The signatories regarded Turks as fellow Muslims who resisted occupation in Turkey as far preferable to the British military forces currently occupying Palestine. The 14 signatories represented such prominent Jerusalem ulama and Ashraf families as the Elamis, Dajanis, Khalidis, Nusaybis, Nashashibis, and all rivals of the Husseini family, and opponents of its influence over the Arab executive. They declared that if the Palestinian delegation opposed these demands, that it did not represent the Ummah. By invoking the Islamic designation for nation, instead of the more secular term watan, the letter underscored the shared Islamic identity of the Arab and Turkish national movements. While the letter certainly suggests to us how some in Palestine believe the prospect of Turkish rule returning to Palestine to be a credible option, it should also highlight how different notable factions exploited the political capital of the Turkish War of Independence in their struggles over control of the Palestinian national movement. Right, so yeah, I obviously see in the past, right, these significant families who often, like, notable Palestinian intellectuals like, Rashid Khalidi. Right, yeah, we see these things, or even Ahad Tamimi, right, this sort of, like, famous, a young girl who punched the IDF officer, right? We see these, like, prominent names come up again and again. The appeal to the Turks at Lausanne failed to impede the progress of the British mandate and its pro-Zionist policy, but for a time, Mustafa Kemal and Turkey retained popularity in Palestine, although ties progressively frayed after the abolitions of the Sultanate and the Caliphate and Turkey's reorientation toward Europe and away from its Middle Eastern neighbors and Ottoman past, right? See, so they... Of course, they were just like, he's like, everyone has to wear a hat, like literally, you must wear a hat. You're
hat pilled, fedora pilled, I guess.
There's this amazing documentary, like a Cold War era documentary about, Mustafa Kemal and everything that he's done in Turkey. And like, how he's, pro-Western, like in this region, and like he's, resisting the communist things, and it's talking about all its amazing accomplishments. But yeah, I'll try if I can dig it up, because if we go into Turkey more, but the Ottoman era is over.
Cold War
so.
Turkey. It is. Well, I was actually going to bring up real quick the other person we covered a lot before intermission, Faisal, and his father Hussein Sharif of Mecca. Now at this time, Faisal ends up becoming the king of Iraq, right? Around I think in 1921.
Yes,
he does, until his death in 1933. Now, of course, like I think we went over a little bit of like basically the double cross of T.E. Lawrence getting Faisal to like lead the Arab revolt, and then during the Versailles the Paris Peace Conference, right, in Versailles. After the war, I think there's a quote I
he also became king of Syria, briefly.
Right, and then also part of that region, like the part of Syria, part of Lebanon, became like kind of a French protectorate. I don't know if it was a mandate per se, but
it was. It was a French mandate for Syria and Lebanon. That was part of the San Remo conference, which also affected this whole area, right? And basically like set the stage for the Mandate of Palestine as well. But yeah, there's the whole Franco-Syrian War, and then Faisal was expelled after that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess Faisal, like, I guess what I'm searching for is like the explanation for why like Faisal could not mount a challenge to the British in the Mandate, and controlling like the area of Iraq, a much larger country. Do you know much about that?
Why he couldn't mount a challenge? I think it was like that he was either like not interested or that he like was deceived. I think that's like the main reason. But yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Oh, actually,
if
I
he
have
desired to. Yeah, do you?
I have a
something?
basic thing here. I'm just reading on like Britannica. I guess what actually happened is he France invaded, Faisal returned to Damascus in 1920. Like at this point, I guess when he was at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, he became clearly aware of French determination to establish a sphere of influence in Lebanon and Syria. Realizing he would have to make concessions, he negotiated the agreement accepting French military occupation of Lebanon and the Syrian coastal regions as far north as Alexandretta, now Iskenderun, Turkey. In January 1920, he returned to Damascus, where he was unable to calm the violent resentment aroused by the news of French pretensions. Most Arab leaders did not understand the futility of resisting French military power, and I mean, another loaded sentence, and the consequent pressures under which he had labored in Paris. When France soon found reason to invade Faisal's kingdom and occupied Damascus in July 1920, Faisal himself was forced into exile, and he eventually went to London at the invitation of the British government. Meanwhile, Britain had established a sphere of influence in Iraq. To ease resistance to British rule, Britain decided in March 1921 to sponsor Faisal as king of an Iraqi government with which Britain would conclude a treaty providing for eventual independence. Faisal accepted the plan and was enthusiastically welcomed in Iraq, where he was crowned in August 1921. His ability to command widespread support in Iraq as well as Syria provided a continuing indication of nationalistic feeling among Arabs of the entire Fertile Crescent. But of course, he was a pan-Arab leader, I guess, from the Hejaz, but he had no specific political roots in Iraq, deriving his authority by moderating various conflicting elements. He valued British friendship while maintaining his full credentials among fervent Arab nationalists as their leader. From his position of influence, he negotiated with Britain a series of treaties, culminating in 1930 with a treaty that enabled Iraq to achieve complete independence and membership in the League of Nations by 1932. So I guess that's, a very basic overview, but I think we kind of have at least a general answer of he had to turn back to the British for sponsorship after the French sort of came after him in Damascus, right?
Yes.
And again, I'm sure we could find much better sources to dig into the specific intrigues of. Well, I would assume that one being sponsored by the British to basically be the king of Iraq and then eventually gain independence in the 30s. Probably a big deal breaker on that table would be fucking around with our authority in the Palestine Mandate, right?
Well, I've been wanting to get into this anyway, and I think this might illuminate the situation a little bit and clarify it, because definitely he'll come up in this. I'll read from this book, Policy of Deceit, which is kind of talking about this sort of false promises to the Arabs and sort of double dealing that took place, right? So between January and June 1919. Paris, as we kind of just talked about, was at once the world's government, its court of appeal and parliament, the focus of its fears and hopes. The international order had to be recreated, perhaps on a different basis. The expectations were enormous, and new economic and political ideas filled the air. Although over 30 countries sent delegates to Paris, all expecting to take part, the conference was inevitably dominated by the big three, Clemenceau, Lord George, and Woodrow Wilson, who met for the first time on 12 January 1919. 6 days later, the peace conference officially opened. Clemenceau ensured that the opening took place on the anniversary of the coronation in 1817 at Versailles of King Wilhelm of Prussia as Kaiser of the new German Empire. Okay. The victors had to impose peace terms on their defeated enemies while they still could, in particular to agree on a settlement for Germany and to draw new lines on the map of Central Europe. Austria was on its knees. An empire dissolved. It had no access to the sea, having lost most of its former territory, including the German-speaking Sudetenland and South Tyrol, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, as well as the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. Bukovina and Bosnia and Herzegovina were also gone. Across Europe, millions were on the move and millions starving. The peacemakers also had to think of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Apart from the future of Germany, the question of Russia and the fear the Bolshevik revolutions would break out throughout Europe was to haunt the conferences. The future of the Ottoman Empire ranked as a lesser issue, especially for the American president, who had not thought through how he was going to put into effect the idealistic principles, his 14 points that he articulated in January 1918. As I've been reading about Woodrow Wilson and like the League of Nations and all that stuff, like I've been thinking the whole time about like Tim Walz, you know, like it's like another like academic guy, you know. I'm like, watch out for these academics when they get into politics, you know. Like
Woodrow Wilson's a strange
ideas.
guy.
Yeah,
I'd like to do a really deep dive on him one day.
Yeah.
Like get into it. Yeah.
Well,
like,
we see.
Didn't he have that weird advisor like House, like Colonel House or something like that?
I think so. I think he was the one who like had that really good friend, Colonel House, right?
And then he was kind of like in a Joe Biden situation after he had a stroke, I think, in the last couple years.
Yeah, they say that.
And was like maybe his wife was kind of running it. Edward M. House, that's who it was. Colonel House. He was not actually a colonel, but
yeah. Well, we definitely see a lot of him here. So anyway, for the French premier, the elderly intellectual tigre of French politics, the settlement with Germany was his top priority. The defeated Boche must never be capable of threatening France again. France wanted revenge and compensation, but above all, it wanted security. Wilson, aloof and scholarly, self-righteous and Bible-quoting, arrived from Washington with his vision of a League of Nations that would stabilize the New World Order and prevent future wars. The defunct European system of the balance of powers had helped to cause the conflict, and he came across the Atlantic with the answer. Wilson arrived, said Lloyd George, like a missionary to rescue the heathen Europeans, with his little sermonettes full of rather obvious remarks. Later, when asked how he thought he had done at Paris, Lloyd George replied, "Not barely, considering I'm seated between Jesus Christ and Napoleon." This book has like a lot of little funny anecdotes, you know. In fact, the intensely pragmatic, intuitive Lloyd George, whom Wilson found slippery, held a pretty good hand. Britain already had some of what it wanted, with the German fleet and the major German colonies safely in its hands, and its troops in control of most of the former Ottoman territories in the Middle East, excluding Egypt, annexed in 1914, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. He understood where Britain's interests lay: its trade and its empire, with naval dominance to protect them and a balance of power in Europe to prevent any power from challenging those interests. His Middle Eastern strategy was to direct the Americans' anti-imperialist ire against the claims presented by France and Italy, distracting the president from areas in which he might make difficulties for Britain. Maurice Hankey, British secretary to the peace conference, recorded in his diary even before the conference convened that Lloyd George means to try and get President Wilson into German East Africa in order to ride him off Palestine. Nevertheless, like Clemenceau, the British Prime Minister was acutely aware the United States had become Europe's banker. Together, the European allies owed over $7 billion to the American government, and about half as much again to American banks. Wilson seemed to assume that the U.S. would get its way simply by applying financial pressure. So I just got a funny picture here of David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. I encourage you to look up a picture of this guy. You know, he's got a mustache, a very interesting mustache.
Good friend of Colonel House, apparently.
Yeah. For the American president, at the heart of his 14 points was the creation of a League of Nations that would serve as a centerpiece of the peace settlements. If it could be brought into being, then everything else would sooner or later fall into place. A system of collective security would ideally prevent future wars. If the new borders were not quite right, the League would sort them out. It would make sure that Germany's former colonies would be run properly. There had to be some arrangement other than annexation or colonization for those parts of the world not yet ready to govern themselves, and the League would act as trustee for those peoples. Lansing, the American Secretary of State, and decidedly more realistic than the president, thought it a calamity that Wilson had ever hit on the phrase. It will raise hopes which can never be realized. It will, I fear, cost thousands of lives. In the end, it is bound to be discredited, to be called the dreams of an idealist who failed to realize the danger until it was too late to check those who attempted to put the principle into force. As for Europeans, they had never been prepared to accept Wilson's quote-unquote utopian 14 points, the claim from safety across the water in January 1918, without serious modification. The French wanted reparations, and the British would not agree to the freedom of the seas, which would prevent them from using a naval blockade as a weapon against their enemies. Of all the ideas Wilson brought to Europe, his concept of self-determination for small nations was perhaps the most controversial, largely because his European allies still tended to think in terms of the spoils of war. For many countries, occupation, annexation, colonies, and indemnities of some sort had been taken for granted in London, Paris, and Rome. The French wanted Togoland and Cameroon and an end to German rights in Morocco. The Italians had their eyes on parts of Somalia. In the British Empire, South Africa wanted German Southwest Africa, Australia wanted New Guinea, and New Zealand wanted German Samoa. The British hoped to annex German East Africa, today's Tanzania, to fill in the missing link between their colonies of the north and the south. And as we have seen, the British and the French were still squabbling secretly to divide up the Ottoman Empire. Wilson protested. They must not go back to the old games, parceling out helpless peoples. He would not stand, he said privately, for dividing the swag. Interesting.
The swag.
Interesting use of swag. If the process of annexation went on, he told the Supreme Council, the League of Nations would be discredited from the beginning. On 25th January, the Peace Conference formally approved the setting up of a commission on the League of Nations to draft a covenant which Wilson insisted on sharing. Clemenceau famously remarked that God himself was content with the 10 Commandments. Wilson modestly inflicted 14 points on us. He was not against the League, he just did not believe in it. Nevertheless, he appointed 2 leading experts of the commission, both lawyers. Lord George appointed Jan Smuts and Lord Robert Cecil, gave them full authority and generally left them to it. Smuts was the ideal choice. A brilliant lawyer and elegant writer, South Africa's foreign minister, whose imperialism equaled that of Lloyd George, had spent much of the latter part of the war in London, where he sat on a small committee of the British cabinet set up to run the war. Already in the previous autumn, he had put pen to paper to transform what he described as Wilson's rather nebulous ideas into a coherent form. His 70-page paper, entitled The League of Nations, A Practical Suggestion, succinctly laid out the organization, structure, roles, and responsibilities of such a league: a general assembly of all member nations, a smaller executive council, a permanent secretariat, steps to settle international disputes and mandates, a form of temporary trusteeship for peoples not yet ready to rule themselves. Smuts later wrote proudly to a friend, "My paper has made an enormous impression in high circles. I see from the cabinet minutes that the Prime Minister called it one of the ablest state papers he had ever read." Wilson incorporated much of Smuts' paper into what became the Covenant of the League. Smuts' Zionist opinions, he had been won to Zionism on meeting Weizmann in June 1917, were also evident in his paper. He wrote that, "There will be found cases where, owing chiefly to the heterogeneous character of the population and their incapacity for administrative cooperation, autonomy in any real sense would be out of the question, and the administration would have to be undertaken to a very large extent by some external authority. This would be the case at any rate for some time to come in Palestine, where the administrative cooperation of the Jewish minority and Arab majority would not be forthcoming." This is a classic, if unsurprising, example of empire thinking. There is almost no historical evidence to suggest that the indigenous Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine would not cooperate post-war. Smuts himself had no experience of the Middle East. On the whole, the British, realizing that there was no point in antagonizing the Americans by talking of adding Germany's territory or anyone else's to their empire, supported the idea of mandates. Initially, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, because of their own territorial ambitions, wanted nothing to do with them. The French reacted to the whole idea with hostility and apprehension. Clemenceau claimed to Poincaré, the French president, Poincaré, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the League of Nations guaranteeing the peace, so be it. But the League of Nations proprietor of colonies? No! Colonies were a mark of power. They had also held what France badly needed, manpower. Henri Simon, the French Minister of Colonies, preferred annexation as being more efficient and better for the natives. All France wished, he declared, was to be able to continue its work of spreading civilization in tropical Africa. On the League Commission, Smuts and Cecil worked out a compromise proposal concerning the mandate concept which Colonel House, Wilson's chief advisor, thought could be the basis of an agreement between the U.S. and its allies. The proposal finally saw the light of day as Article 22 of the League Covenant, which is mentioned in the mandate, which included the sentence, "The character of the mandate much differ according to the stage of the development of the people, the geographical situation of the territory, its economic conditions, and other similar circumstances." This resulted in 3 types of mandate. A, for nations, such as those in the Middle East, which were nearly ready to run their own affairs. B, where the mandatory power would run them. And C, for territories that were contiguous or close to the mandatory, which would administer the mandated territory as part of its own. For the purpose of our story, it is what is notable is that the 2 British Empire representatives on the commission drafting the League Covenant, General Smuts and Lord Robert Cecil, had both been won over to Zionism by Weizmann in the summer of 1917. Neither Mesopotamia nor Syria, including Palestine, nor the Balfour Declaration, was specifically mentioned in the drafted covenant. but it was clear to all that the mandates for those territories would be awarded to the British and the French. On 14th February, Wilson presented a draft of the League Covenant to a plenary session of the Peace Conference. That night, he left for the United States, confident that he had accomplished his main purpose. He returned to Paris a month later. On 28th April, a plenary session of the conference approved the covenant. 2 months later, representatives of the new German government were summoned to Versailles, and they signed a peace treaty with the Allies. The covenant was signed the same day as Part 1 of the Treaty of Versailles. Historians have been arguing about the treaty's content and legacy, too harsh or too lenient, ever since. The covenant, together with the rest of the treaty, came into force on 10th January 1920, signed by 44 states, and thus the mandate system, Article 22 of the covenant, became an integral part of international law. The same article also contained the oft-quoted patronizing phrase, "To those colonies and territories inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world, there should be applied the principle that the well-being and development of such peoples form a sacred trust of civilization, and that securities for the performance of this trust should be embodied in this covenant." However, between 1920 and 1948, the Palestinians in particular would experience little that was either sacred or trustworthy in British rule. So then we have a little bit about Faisal here. When Faisal arrived in Paris in January 1919 as the head of the Hejaz delegation to the peace conference, he encountered three main influences at work in opposition to the fulfillment of Arab hopes, namely the British imperial interests in Iraq and Palestine, the French imperial interest in Syria, and the Zionist national interest in Palestine, in coordination with Britain. Although Faisal, representing his father, and the representatives of the Zionist organization were both at the conference, of the two it was the latter who were much better organized. Their delegation, some 27 strong, had been in Paris since December 1918 to prepare papers for the presentation of their case, to reconstitute Palestine as a Jewish commonwealth before the Council of Ten. The initial 40-page draft, presented to the British delegation on 20th January 1919 and entitled Memorandum of the Zionist Organization relating to the reconstruction of Palestine as a Jewish national home, pressed the notion that Palestine must be developed into a Jewish commonwealth under a British trusteeship. Among other things, it demanded the installation of a Jewish governor, the nationalization of all absentee-owned lands, and a Jewish majority in the executive and legislative councils. In deference to British objections, a shorter anodyne second draft eliminated the demands for land expropriation and a Jewish governor, as well as a Jewish majority in the executive and legislative councils. Indeed, Weizmann and Samuel met on 30th and 31st January with Ormsby Gore, Arnold Toynbee, and Robert Cecil, all attached to the British delegation, to make sure they were in agreement before the new draft, reduced to 14 pages and entitled Statement of the Zionist Organization Regarding Palestine, was submitted to the British on 3rd February. On 6th February, Faisal and Lawrence, both in Arab dress, appeared before the Council of Ten. Although the tone of Faisal's speech, translated by Lawrence, was both visionary and conciliatory, its content lacked hard detail, having no talk of the correspondence or other wartime pledges. He outlined his father's claim to all of Syria, including Palestine, and Mesopotamia as a possible future, independent pan-Arab state. 2 points in the 8-page statement he handed to the commissioners are particularly noteworthy. First, the privileges, special administrative status, of Lebanon, which did not impair Syrian unity, would be respected under a guarantee by the League of Nations. Second, he personally was prepared to accept a controlled Jewish immigration and the extension of existing Jewish colonies in Palestine. But the extreme demands made by the Zionists had greatly disturbed the people, so much so that they rejected Zionism in its entirety. Near the end of his speech, the emir said that should the members of the Supreme Council have any lingering doubts about popular consent, he invited them to send a committee of inquiry to poll Syrian Arabs. However, Faisal's vision of a unified Arab state was the last thing the Allies wanted. His presence in Paris was an embarrassment to the French and British alike. He was holding the British to their word and getting in the way of the French imperial ambitions. In fact, few Europeans took him or the Arab cause seriously, and the conference was dominated by Clemenceau and Lloyd George, men more than twice Faisal's age, who were dead set against the Wilsonian principles of self-determination. The Zionist mission, as it was officially called, appeared before the Council of Ten on 27th February. It was a historic occasion for the Zionists, the first opportunity to present their case before an international forum, which in and of itself represented validation of a sort. Nahum Sokolow, the Secretary General of the World Zionist Congress, who described the previous 18 centuries of Jewish suffering, was followed by Weizmann. So basically, this is what David Simon is operating from this document now, who outlined the tragedy of the Jews in Eastern Europe. In Palestine, he claimed, 5 million Jews could be settled without encroaching on the legitimate interests of the present inhabitants. 1 million Jews in Eastern Europe were awaiting the signal to move. Their proposal, the development of an administration under a mandatory power, which would allow for the immigration to Palestine of 70 to 80,000 Jews annually. Menachem Ushikin spoke in Hebrew on behalf of some 3 million Russian Jews, and finally the French Orientalist Sylvain Lévy praised some Zionist achievements, but to the other speaker's annoyance expressed some criticism of Zionist aims. Weizmann later recalled that following the hearing, the U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing had called him over and asked him what he meant by a Jewish national home. I love this. I define it to mean the creation of administration which would arise out of the national conditions of the country, always safeguarding the interests of non-Jews, with the hope that by Jewish immigration, Palestine would ultimately become as Jewish as England is English. The Zionist task was indeed a difficult one, but the question was not whether Zionism was difficult, but whether it was possible, and took as my example the outstanding successes the French had at that time made of Tunisia. What the French could do in Tunisia, I said, the Jews would be able to do in Palestine, with Jewish will, Jewish money, Jewish power, and Jewish enthusiasm. That does not sound good today. Sounds yeah, I mean, a lot of this, yeah, woof. Anyway, later, when Ben-Gurion asked Weizmann, why didn't you demand a Jewish state in Palestine? Weizmann replied, we didn't demand one because they wouldn't have given us one. Well, you asked only for conditions which would allow us to build the Jewish state in the future. It is simply a matter of tactics. Although Sokolow, Weizmann, and Ushishkin shared the same vision of a future Jewish state, of the three, the latter was always more forthcoming, less tactical in his use of language. He would later write that the whole of Palestine, or at least most of it, must belong to the Jewish people. This can be achieved by 3 means. By force, we do not have it, governmental coercion, or purchase. There you go. While the Supreme Council, who sat in judgment over Faisal's and the Zionist representations, gave no verdict, the victorious powers accepted the Balfour Declaration, a partial Zionist victory. But as no peace treaty was yet signed with Turkey, negotiations with the defeated empire were fractious, the questions of granting Britain the mandate for Palestine and what its borders should be were held in abeyance. It is noteworthy that at one point during the government's discussion concerning the future of Muslim Turkey, Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, declared, "Let us not, for heaven's sake, tell the Muslim what he ought to think. Let us recognize what they think." To which Balfour replied, "I am quite unable to see why heaven or any other power should object to our telling the Muslim what he ought to think." All right.
Interesting.
Balfour clearly applied the same mindset to the Arab former subjects of the Ottoman Empire as well. Lloyd George's outlook was equally racist. During the discussions, he predicted that the competing nationalist claims in Palestine were going to grow up into 2 troublesome chickens. The Jews' virile, brave, determined intelligence, the Arabs' decadent, dishonest, and producing little beyond eccentrics, influenced by the romance and silence of the desert. So
okay.
Okay. You can really see what's going on here, and that's, I think, reflected in, what parts of the mandate we read, right? Like, you can see it's not, like, even though there are these kind of, like, assurances, which, like, there was contention, like, they had, like, that's the thing, like, even though, like, these Orientalists and stuff like that were awful, and even though there's many criticisms, like, that you can make of Woodrow Wilson, like, on balance, like, a horrible person, like, he still had this kind of, like, vision that he was obsessed with, and you had, like, these people who are like, you can't declare a Jewish state right now, so they weren't going to grant them that right away,
right.
But you can totally see, like, it wasn't like this thing where it was under the MUFTI or whatever, or something like that, or whatever, if people might imagine, or that it was a neutral situation where Britain was just trying to, administer everything fairly. Like, there was a clear goal in mind. Like, that is unambiguous, right? Like, and what the meaning of a quote-unquote Jewish national home was, that's the ambiguity they exploited in order to kind of, like, because, like, if there's, that's, like, where Jews, mostly live or something, or, like, a place where Jews can go or something like that, but is not an apartheid state, doesn't, like, require the expulsion of Palestinians or a massive, like, demographic shift and the disenfranchisement of Arabs and the expropriation of land and things like that. There's a lot of ambiguity around there. People would be,
tactical ambiguity.
Faisal even kind of acknowledged that, like, that there's a compromise to be made, right? Despite the apparent inability to compromise and their leaders insisting that no compromise is possible, it seems like one side mainly is the one that would not compromise. Or they would, but only tactically, you know.
They
so
looked like they were throwing them a bone, and then this also...
And they weren't throwing the Arabs a bone, they were throwing the British a bone, because they didn't have the power to do what they wanted yet, you know. Right.
I mean, they didn't, like, it wouldn't have been wise at that point to, like, push for that. They needed the numbers, like the manpower to, like, press their position, and they knew that under the British protection, like, I mean, the number that they threw out there, 80,000, if that went on for a decade, that's 800,000 people, which, you know, the overall population of Palestine around this time is like, I mean, it might have been a little depopulated because of the war, actually. So maybe around like 800,000 total. So you're talking about like doubling the population in one decade and turning them, that would turn them into a majority. Effect going from like 6%, 7% to a majority of the population in not that long of a time. So, I mean, they played their cards like smartly, I think, in this period. Just to say about Wilson, though, and the 14 points, it is interesting. Like, lest we almost like let him off the hook as an idealist a little too hard. I'd actually like to read more about this, but like the specific context of him putting this together and everything. But a huge motivation for him rolling out the 14 points was the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin's like peace plan, his like alternative peace plan that he proposed. And Wilson basically like feared, you know, both that communist revolutions would start in other countries and also that like Lenin would basically like take like the lead in the world as like the most progressive like leader. Yeah, historian N.M. Phelps wrote in January 1918 that Wilson, quote, needed to seize the moment if he was going to avoid being eclipsed by Lenin's competing program for the post-war world. And then in January 5th, 1918, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George gave a speech in London stating the British war aims were, quote, self-determination for the subject peoples of the Austrian and Ottoman empires. So that was also like
and that's
factored into all of this as well, like having to like outpace Lenin, like Lenin's like his Bolshevik idealism with like
that is
his
actually
own, like,
pretty
liberal.
Yeah, that's actually pretty important, and also like that it becomes a concern even like within the British mandate in Palestine, right? Because there were a lot of like communists, like communist Jews, who were among like the immigrants there, right? Like, and there was that was something that definitely was a cause for concern, right? That's another thing. Like, there were like non-Zionist Jews, or you know, I guess it's a little bit ambiguous, but people who had a different vision of this, right? And this, so that definitely was something that loomed over this whole enterprise in general, even in this particular context, right? We talked a little bit about some of that, or some of the sort of growing like communist sympathies, right? That existed among Arabs as well as Jews.
Right. I think you've done a book about that, right? Like communist activities in the British Mandate period.
Yeah,
that'd be cool to get into.
Yeah.
Coming up ahead.
Yeah, definitely. But sorry.
Oh no.
This also kind of has to do with what you're talking about Faisal. When American diplomats at the Peace Conference proposed an Allied commission to investigate the popular sentiment in Greater Syria, both their French and British counterparts reluctantly greeted it with public approval. Officially called the 1919 Inter-Allied Commission on Mandates in Turkey, it was originally meant to include French, British, Italian, and American representatives. However, it ended as a two-man American investigation after the others withdrew their participation to avoid the risk of being confronted with recommendations which would no doubt have conflicted with their policies. In Syria, including Palestine, the populations understandably thought that their views would be taken into account by the powers. With its professed commitment to esteem public opinion, foster representative government, and respect the facts, the Commission inspired optimism about the Middle East. Judging from newspaper accounts of the day, there was every expectation among the Arabs that the Commission's findings would impact the peace conference and ensure the independent future of Palestine. According to Antonius, when Faisal heard the news in Paris that a commission was to be appointed, he drank champagne for the first time in his life, confident that it would confirm Syrian independence under Hashemite rule.
No,
Oof.
wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
I shouldn't have had that champagne. Obviously, Allah was not pleased.
Yep.
Lord Allenby appeared to think that the commission would decide the future of the various Turkish territories, but Balfour immediately put him right. They will have no power to decide, but after examining all the facts of the case, will tender their advice to the Council of the Principal Allied Powers, who will have to take the final decision. The commission, led by Dr. Henry C. King, president of Oberlin College, Ohio, and Charles R. Crane, an American businessman and prominent member of the Democratic Party, visited areas of Palestine. Can you imagine, like, if this, like, I mean, yeah, it's really funny to think of, like, two random, like, basically,
Oberlin
like, people
College
who,
professor
like,
guy.
love Woodrow Wilson, like, his friends, like, getting sent out to, like, theoretically determine the fate of the entire Middle East, although it seems like they had no power at all because what they were doing was surveying people and their opinions didn't, Anyway,
anyways.
By all accounts, both commissioners were men of intelligence and independence whose impartiality is unassailable. Among other things, they found that the Arabs of Palestine desired unity with an independent Syria, as the Zionists claim that they had a right to Palestine based on an occupation 2,000 years ago can hardly be seriously considered. However, Lloyd George and Clemenceau had other plans for the region, and the Commission's recommendations were neither officially considered nor published. The whole report was in effect pigeonholed and ignored, although it did sour Anglo-French relations, at least temporarily, especially when Clemenceau suggested the Commission should also survey public opinion in British-occupied Mesopotamia. More fundamentally, it aroused such false hopes.
Keep surveying. Surveying. We love it. Yeah.
More fundamentally, it aroused such false hopes among various groups of Arabs that Gertrude Bell, the Arabic-speaking influential Oriental secretary to Percy Cox, the High Commissioner in Baghdad, denounced it as a criminal deception.
Wow.
The High Commission's findings were only published in December 1922 in Editor and Publisher, an American monthly magazine, and although the report had no political impact on the fate of the Middle East at the time, it remains a historical reference point for Palestinians to prove the existence of their movement and potential nation-statehood in a period of Zionism's infancy. There you go. Arab aspirations were inevitably low in the pecking order of international concern after a war which had seen such a massive bloodletting in Europe. For the French, Faisal's removal from Damascus, where he was de facto ruler, was merely a matter of time. The determination to take Syria, combined with Lord George's realpolitik, gave the Hashemites a little chance. Sorry, it gave them little chance, like a small chance. But Britain was not going to frustrate the Middle East ambitions of France for the sake of its Arab allies, heavily dependent though they were on British money, arms, and military advice. In this regard, Balfour's lengthy and oft-quoted memorandum of 11th August 1919, dealing with the future of Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, deserves to be quoted at length. It reveals the mindset of one of Britain's most influential decision-makers of the era, in particular concerning the self-government of the Arab provinces and the manner in which the contradictory wartime pledges should be resolved. In the opinion of the British foreign minister, the root of the trouble was in 5 documents: the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Anglo-French Declaration of November 1918, the Covenant of the League of Nations that was approved in February 1919, and the directions given to the King-Crane Commission, sent out to ascertain the wishes of the people of Greater Syria. Balfour wrote that these documents were inconsistent with one another. In 1915, we promised the Arabs independence, and the promise was unqualified, except in respect of certain territorial reservations. In 1918, the promise was by implication repeated, for no other interpretation can, I think, be placed by an unbiased reader on the phrase in the Anglo-French Declaration about a, quote, national government and a, quote, administration deriving its authority from the choice of the native population. Okay. In our promises with regard to the frontiers of the new Arab states, we do not seem to have been more fortunate than in our promises about their independence. In 1915, it was a Sharif of Mecca to whom the task of delimitation was to have been confided, nor were any reservations placed upon his discretion in this matter, except certain reservations intended to protect French interests in western Syria and Cilicia. I have no idea what that even is supposed to be. What is a Cilicia? What?
Silesia? Silesia?
I guess it's a geographical region in southern Anatolia. I say, yeah, never heard of it before.
Different. Yeah, not Silesia.
Okay, so yeah, I guess obviously, part of their Ottoman. Kilikia, that's what they call it. Yes, I guess it's like Kilikia. That's how they pronounce it. Maybe the British pronounce it differently. I don't know. But anyway, so the 1919 covenant speaks as follows. The wishes of the communities, i.e. the independent nations, must be a principal consideration in the selection of a mandatory. The sentiment is unimpeachable, but how is it to be carried into effect? To simplify the argument, let us assume that two of the independent nations for which the mandatories have to be provided are Syria and Palestine. Take Syria first. Do we mean in the case of Syria to consult principally the wishes of the inhabitants? We mean nothing of the kind. We are going chiefly to consider the wishes of the inhabitants in deciding which of these, England, America, France, is to be selected. We are going to do nothing of the kind. England has refused. America will refuse so that whatever the inhabitants may wish, it is France they will certainly have. The contradiction between the letter of the covenant and the policy of the Allies is even more flagrant in the case of the independent nation of Palestine than in that of the independent nation of Syria. Or the quote, sorry, you put the independent nation in scare quotes here. For in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, though the American Commission has been going through the form of asking what they are. The four great powers are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, and far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. In my opinion, that is right. What I have never been able to understand is how it can be harmonized with the Declaration, the Covenant, or the instructions of the Commission of Inquiry. Whatever be the future of Palestine, it is not now an independent nation, nor is it yet on its way to become one. Whatever deference should be paid to the views of those who live there, the powers in their selection of a mandatory do not propose, as I understand the matter, to consult them. In short, so far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate. Such, a tangle of hypocrisy and contradictory commitments was no mere expression of a senior decision-maker's opinions. In hindsight, it was a private statement of policy that arguably radically altered the course of history for millions of people in the Middle East. Yeah, so this is, George Kidston, a senior Foreign Office official, minuted on the memorandum. Mr. Balfour's suggestions are admirable. First of all, that's the last word that would come out of my mouth that they're reading that, but okay.
Yeah.
Are admirable as indicating a broad line of policy, but I doubt if he realizes the difficulties of the details. Nor does he take into consideration the intense dislike of Faisal and his Arabs for a French mandate and the growing feeling of the Arabs for a union under a single mandatory. Palestine is to go to the Zionists irrespective of the wishes of the great bulk of the population, because it is historically right and politically expedient that it should do so. The idea that the carrying out of either of these programs, the French mandate for Syria and the British mandate for Palestine, will entail bloodshed and military repression never seems to have occurred to him. 10 days after Balfour's memorandum, The Times, whose diplomatic correspondent, Aubrey Kennedy, followed closely such developments in Foreign Office thinking, published an article in which the terms of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were described as unworkable. They were, in Kennedy's judgment, not in harmony with engagements contracted towards the King of the Hejaz in the autumn of 1915, when two senior members of Balfour's staff, Eric Forbes Adam and Robert Van Sittart, took exception to the article and suggested to their minister that they correct the Times' misconceptions. Balfour responded, "It is rather dangerous to speak to the Times in this sense unless we can reconcile our letter to Hussein in 1915 with the SP agreement in 1916. I cannot. Can anyone else?" The Arabs came to regard the peace conference as yet another betrayal by the great powers. Although there had been much talk, inspired by President Wilson, of a new international order based on self-determination and collective security, when all had been drafted and signed, it looked singularly just like another version of the familiar old story. To the victor, the spoils. On paper, the mandatory system, a temporary trusteeship, was not quite the same as old-style colonialism, primarily because its charter implied a time limit, and also because each mandatory power was responsible to the Permanent Mandates Commission, an international body of critics that had the right to review the power's actions once a year. Nevertheless, as historian H.A.L. Fisher succinctly and accurately put it, the peace treaties draped the crudity of conquest in the veil of morality. Yet, writing 20 years later, Lloyd George clearly remained irritated by claims that he had not honored the wartime pledges to the Arabs. The Allies redeemed the promises made in these declarations to the full. No race has done better out of fidelity with which the Allies redeemed their promises to the oppressed races than the Arabs. The Palestinian Arabs fought for Turkish rule. Well, yes. By the autumn of 1919, the British government had decided that for economic reasons it could no longer continue to maintain an army of some 400,000 troops in the provinces of the Ottoman Empire it had conquered. In early September, Allenby was summoned to Deauville, a small town on the Normandy coast, where Lloyd George and his entourage were occasionally based during the peace conference. to discuss the military occupation of Syria, Cilicia, Palestine, and Mesopotamia, in particular which provinces should be evacuated, meaning those for which the government did not propose to accept permanent responsibility. As a result of the 4 meetings that took place between 9 and 11 September 11th, another one, an aide-memoire was drawn up for the Prince Minister to hand to the French Premier and eventually to Emir Faisal, which spelled out in detail the decision to withdraw British troops, in particular from the Lebanon region, and their replacement by French troops. On Saturday, 13 September, Lloyd George handed this to Monsieur Clemenceau, and 2 days later he communicated it to the Supreme Council in Paris, who noted it, but did not officially approve or reject it. The Emir arrived in London on 18 September at Lloyd George's invitation, officially to discuss the future arrangements for Syria and Mesopotamia. At 10 Downing Street the following morning, Faisal, who understood only a modicum of English, and 2 of his advisors found themselves sitting opposite the Prime Minister, who was flanked by the leader of the House Bonar-Lar, Lord Curzon, Field Marshal Allenby, and 4 senior officials. After informing the Emir that the government had no intention of continuing to occupy certain provinces, that the British people were complaining of the burden of expense, the Prime Minister explained the government had therefore decided to withdraw their troops from all these territories except Mesopotamia and Palestine. Under Lloyd George's predecessors, Great Britain entered into 2 distinct sets of written obligations with the King of the Hejaz and with the President of the French Republic, and they were bound to respect both equally. As previously described in the survey of 1915 to 1919 interpretations, the Prime Minister then read out the key phrases from the English version of McMahon's 24th October 1915 letter, a copy of which he handed to the Emir, and which he described as the engagement entered into with King Hussein. He continued, the point about this engagement was that Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo were recognized as being within the Arab state. King Hussein had been told the district of Mersina and Alexandria, and portions of Syria lying to the west of that line, could not be said to be purely Arab, and should be excluded from the proposed limits and boundaries of the Arab territory. The agreement entered into with the French in 1916 also provided that Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo should be Arab, but that the area to the west of those towns should be subject to such direct or indirect administration or control as the French desire, and as they may think fit to arrange with the Arab state or confederation of Arab states. He emphasized that the aide-memoire was temporary, strictly military, and not a political measure. All that they now proposed was to evacuate these territories and hand over their garrisons in accordance with the agreement entered into with King Hussein. The eventual settlement will be determined by the Treaty of Peace with Turkey. He then assured the Emir that he had informed Clemenceau that the British government could not hand over Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo to French troops, and that when the Field Marshal ordered his troops out of those places, he would hand over the towns to the Emir Faisal to hold until the peace treaty finally decided their disposition. West of that line, the Field Marshal would retire in favor of French troops, who would occupy the country until the peace treaty decided on its eventual disposition. The Arab forces had redeemed the pledges they had given to Great Britain, and we should redeem our pledges. The Prime Minister's use of the word line twice in this meeting can thus be added to the previous 8 British interpretations of the correspondence. This is, getting into the weeds here, but Faisal, however, had no knowledge of either the Lloyd George Clemenceau verbal compact of December 1918 or of the uninterrupted British government negotiations with the Zionist organization, which by the end of 1919 had resulted in a detailed and provisionally agreed draft mandate for Palestine. This begs the question as to the extent to which the government deliberately kept their Arab ally in the dark between 1917 and 1922. With Balfour in Paris during the conference, Curzon was placed in charge of the current affairs of the Foreign Office at home. Theoretically, there was coordination, but decisions were taken in Paris without consultation with London, which sometimes did not hear of them until much later. The Palestine policy was a case in point. Curzon only became aware of the draft mandate negotiations and their tenor months after they were initiated. When handing the aide-memoire to the Emir, the Prime Minister emphasized that it was in no sense an agreement. It had been prepared by the Field Marshal Lord Allenby, Bonar-Lar, and himself before he ever saw Clemenceau in Paris, and was not the result of negotiations with the French government behind the back of the Arab representatives. The government had to decide to withdraw in such a way as would conform to the agreements made with the King of the Hejaz, as set forth in the correspondence. He concluded by expressing the hope that the Emir would fall in with these temporary arrangements, and informing him the evacuation was scheduled to begin on 1st November. The Emir immediately protested at this ill-disguised attempt to impose a Sykes-Picot agreement on the region, which he declared would be a death sentence to the Arab nation. Moreover, it was an unjust return to a policy of ambitious imperialism. The Arabs had fought against the Turks not with the intention of dividing the country by giving a share to the French and a portion to the British. His family could not tolerate that stain on its history and would withdraw. The McMahon correspondence, according to the Emir, had been based on the same principles as those on which the war with Germany was fought, namely justice and the freedom of peoples, but the Sykes-Picot Agreement was based on colonization. The Emir emphasized that the evacuation of the Western Zone by the British troops and their replacement by French troops would lead to a rising if there was no British administration to appeal to, and that Great Britain would be responsible for any bloodshed that might ensue. The Prime Minister replied that if bloodshed occurred, he would be very distressed, but he had inherited 2 sets of engagements from his predecessors and was bound to keep both sets. In response, Faisal solemnly protested in the name of the Arab nation against any change to be introduced into the prevailing form of military administration in Syria. The status quo should remain until the final decision of the peace conference as to the future form of Syria's government. After all, Lord Allenby had confirmed to him a month previously that his military administration would continue in Syria until a final decision by the peace conference was reached. Not only that, but the British government, via the High Commissioner in Cairo, had informed King Hussein that Jamal Pasha had distorted the original purpose of the Sykes-Picot Agreement when publicizing it, and omitted its stipulations regarding the consent of native populations. In fact, as previously mentioned, the agreement contained no such stipulation. Finally, Faisal stated that the same stipulation regarding the consent of the people was confirmed in November 1918 by the formal declaration made conjointly by Great Britain and France. The Emir asked whether the government still stood by that formal declaration, and whether the opinion of the people had been taken as a new proposed occupation. Lloyd George made no reply. Faisal then proposed that the whole situation should be immediately placed before the peace conference, or failing that, a subcommittee of the conference, and that should it be found necessary to withdraw, why not withdraw all European troops from Syria and leave responsibility to the Arab government, who were prepared to be responsible to the Allied and associated powers for the interior security of the country until such time as the peace conference decided the future of Syria. Lloyd George demurred, wow, very demure, very cutesy, the original demure, and politely brought the meeting to an end. Following a second, equally fruitless meeting 4 days later, where both sides held to their positions, both Lord Curzon and the Prime Minister wrote to the Emir in an endeavor to help him see reason and, if possible, to acquiesce. Curzon attached copies of the McMahon correspondence with his letter of 9th October and wrote that the government's obligations to King Hussein and the French government did not conflict, but were complementary. Curzon added, "From this correspondence, 2 things are clear. First, that the British government are bound by their undertakings to King Hussein to recognize the establishment of an independent Arab state comprising within its borders the 4 towns of Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo. And second, that they made it absolutely clear to your illustrious father before the entry of the Arabs into the war that they regarded France as having a special right in the area west of these 4 towns. They did not communicate to King Hussein this, because it was in complete conformity with the undertakings they had already entered into with him." He concluded, "Her Majesty's government does not see any proposal other than the aide-memoire, which is practicable for the interim period. There is no authority of weight who believes that the people of Syria can stand alone at the present time. To attempt this solution, which you suggest, would simply be to prejudice the free and rapid progress and ultimately the independence of the Syrian and Arab peoples. It is essential that until the peace is made with Turkey, some first-class European power should hold the territory to the southeast of Anatolia." Note that Curzon here follows Toynbee and Lord George's line interpretation and describes the reserved areas as synonymous with French interests. Considering the government's communications with the king, perhaps Curzon had not read all the previous papers relating to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, including McMahon's recommendation in May 1916 that it would be better not to divulge the details to the Sharif or any other Arab leader. According to the High Commissioner, there was a risk of possible misinterpretation, and it might be prejudicial to our present good relations. The Foreign Office, using the unusual first-person singular, had promptly approved. "I agree that the details of the arrangement should not be divulged." Lloyd George wrote a day later to the Emir in more robust terms, "It does not seem to me that the proposal that you now make is practicable. His Majesty's government have made up their mind that it is impossible for them to continue the occupation of Syria by British troops. 6 months ago, they announced at the peace conference and to yourself that under no circumstances would they accept a mandate for Syria. It is therefore impossible for His Majesty's government to withdraw the proposals which they have made for dealing with the Syrian problem in the interim period until the peace conference can settle it. The official records of these meetings, written by the cabinet secretary, indicate that they were not so much a matter of consultation with the emir as a policy imposed, albeit in diplomatic discourse. The decision had been taken, and the emir was expected to fall in line. However, even after a third and final meeting with Lloyd George and his senior officials on 13 October, the emir still politely refused to, quote, see reason. The Prime Minister, Lord Curzon and Lord Allenby, subsequently urged Faisal to go to Paris and put his case to the French government. In Paris, senior government officials brushed aside all the emir's proposals, determined as they were not to discuss politics with him until there was a strong contingent of French troops on the ground in and around Beirut. They merely assured him that the new French commander in Syria, General Henri Gourand, thoroughly understood Syria and would do anything for the welfare of that country.
You trust us, he would do anything.
Yeah, he would do anything.
This is real gaslight diplomacy.
Yeah.
Right? They're just gaslighting him. Like,
yes, exactly.
Aggressively. Of like, don't worry about it. Yeah, just like let the French garrisons like set themselves up and then we'll totally talk about it. It just wouldn't be prudent. It wouldn't be prudent.
Exactly, and this is like kind of what I'm saying. Like he was kind of deceived partially, and also he felt he couldn't send him to the British, and he also just couldn't send him to the French, right? Because eventually he was expelled from Syria by the military forces in 1920, as you said, right? Yeah. So that's kind of what happened to him. But then he was, as you said before, installed by the British on the throne of the new state of Iraq the following summer. So yeah. So
he ends up hard to get away from like this partnership with the British, despite their extremely shady, fucking self-serving, like two-faced behavior. He's sort of forced to like still rely upon their patronage throughout the entire Mandate period, which obviously complicates any efforts to do that. However, his brother Abdullah also kind of went on a different trajectory that might become more relevant later on, because his destiny also like intersects heavily, especially during, like the Nakba in 1948, right? And sort of terminates actually after that as a result. But yeah, the sons of Sharif Hussein, continue to be players in this game, but like they're not really able to challenge like the British once they cement themselves.
Yeah, and they were basically like deceived and betrayed because they weren't considered to be like full partners diplomatically, full human beings. Not the way like that's how I like kind of read the underpinning of this, is that like, well, these are just stupid Arabs, who can like, in the French that matter more because they're more powerful, but they're also Europeans. I mean the author of, I should note Peter Shambrook is the author of this book. And he makes that is Policy of Deceit, and he makes a note here that apart from the Balfour Declaration, other wartime pledges did not figure in either Paris during the spring of 1919 or in parliamentary debates at Westminster during that year. In October 1919, Bonar Law, conservative leader of the House, briefly explained the government's policy regarding the occupied Turkish territories. While no final statement can now be made, if the peace conference grants to Great Britain a mandate for any of the territories of the ex-Turkish Empire, it is the intention of His Majesty's government to introduce forms of administration which will give every encouragement to the growth and development of local governments and institutions. Bonar Law's statement was standard liberal empire speak, and quite misleading because by October 1919 the government had already decided to withhold the development of any local or national representative government in Palestine. Christopher Sykes, among other writers, completely misreads British intentions when he states that Churchill offered the Palestinian Arabs representative government in Palestine in 1921. According to Sykes, Churchill even pressed it on both sides. He also becomes like a significant figure in all of this, right? Because
he does,
he basically was like in one of the main administrators of the whole thing.
Was he the Lord of the Colonies like throughout this period? Is that where he sort of ended up and stayed?
I know feel like the title wasn't Lord of the Colonies, is like hilariously English as that sounds. You may be right. He was Secretary of State for the colonies.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So more or less Lord of the Colonies.
Yeah, I'm reading. I'm looking at a little more about T.E. Lawrence, who I guess just drops off at this entire period during like the Faisal betrayal, and like loses all interest in kind of like becoming a Bedouin, which is like it's sort of become his entire. He really like went undercover and like dissolved into. He went full Lady Gaga, and throughout everything that wasn't whatever, I forget what his if he had an adopted Arab name or not, but then he kind of like he snaps back and then leads a kind of weird reclusive life after that. but the Discourse on Domination book like uses him and Captain Lugard, who is a colonial official in Nigeria and also in Uganda early on. And I'm forgetting the third person that she profiles, but just to show like in their writings and stuff, like the sort of the use of language and concepts and like the mindset of like the imperialist agent, and how like on the one hand they kind of romanticize, like we kind of all know this, but they romanticize the native, you know, but then at the same time, especially once they like kind of gain their advantage, like they ultimately turn around. And it's like T.E. Lawrence was obsessed with Faisal at first and was like, this guy is like incredible. Like he is like this desert, like king, mystic, blah, blah, blah. But then like later he's like, he was stupid and like sucked. And like he was fucking not talented. And like he said it was like, he said it was like degrading to both of us that I had to ally myself with him or something like that. Let me see if I could find that quote. It was pretty fucked up. But this was that. Like he talks about, that T.E. This is actually a funny paragraph when he profiles all the sons of Hussein, and like, you know, he thought Abdullah was like a little bit of a prankster and a bad boy and a playboy and phlegmatic when it came to field action, but T.E. thought he could rely on Faisal for warmongering and dynamiting Turks. He described him, says, looks like a European and very like the monument of Richard I at Fontevraud, hot-tempered, proud, and impatient, personal magnetism, very clever. So then I guess once he picked Faisal, he never looked back. If the moment of decision-making is, as Derrida proposes, a moment of madness, of, quote, non-knowledge that marks the suspension of deliberation and reason, then it was in a moment of madness that T.E., guided by a vision of Faisal as avatar, threw on full Arab MUFTI and launched himself into guerrilla warfare against the Turks. A spectacular desert adventure ensued over 2 years, and the two photogenic men in matching attire famously galloped the Turks out of Wedge, Medina, Aqaba, and finally, gloriously, Damascus. However, with the war behind them, as immersed in Faisal's voice, movement, stature, and real or projected magnetism as he had been in the desert, in the same way that Lugard abruptly lost interest in King Mwenga in Uganda, T.E. inexplicably wrote of his former protege and brother-in-arms, quote, Faisal was a brave, weak, ignorant spirit, trying to do work for which only a genius, a prophet, or a great criminal was fitted. I served him out of pity, a motive which degraded us both.
Oh,
ouch.
All right.
She says Faisal might have been gutted to read that, right? I mean, talk about a fake friend. This is interesting too. It says, T.E.'s unassuming manner, something which dated back to his days at Oxford, equipped him to deal with the prickly, guarded Bedouin. His 27 articles, published in the Confidential Arab Bulletin in August 1917, was meant to serve as a guide to new army recruits on how to handle Arabs. In this article, he explained that his guidelines, and they are only that, since, quote, handling Hijaz Arabs is an art, not a science, should only be applied to the Bedouin and not to the townspeople of Syria who require completely different treatment. He reminds his readers that Britain is lucky to have won over King Hussein, who had also been pursued by Germany, and that great tact was required to maintain his devotion. So it asks a little later, like, he's describing these things, but like, what is he describing them for? And like, who is he describing them for?
There's an interesting article, this is interesting time as well, because first of all, like, as we were kind of reading in that, in the Mandate, I'm not sure who read the actual article, but one of the articles of the Mandate is that, like, there's going to be, like, an antiquities department established, right? Like, something that is, like, going to be in charge of, like, historical relics and artifacts and objects, like, of importance, right? And, like, kind of being the custodians of the history of Palestine, right? Like, let me see if I can find the text of the Mandate again. Yeah, I think it's article 21, second to last. The mandatory shall secure the enactment within 12 months from this date and shall ensure the execution of a law of antiquities based on the following rules. This law shall ensure equality of treatment in the matter of excavations and archaeological research to the nationals of all state members in the League of Nations. So antiquity means any construction or any product of human activity earlier than the year 1700 AD. The law for the protection of antiquity shall proceed by encouragement rather than by threat. Any person who, having discovered an antiquity without being furnished with the authorization referred in paragraph 5, reports the same to an official of the competent department shall be rewarded according to the value of the discovery. No antiquity may be disposed of except to the competent department unless the department renounces the acquisition of any such antiquity. Blah, blah, going on sort of basic, it belongs in a museum type stuff. But there's this interesting article that kind of talks about this. I mean, this is also, interestingly, like kind of the beginning of tourism that was run by tourism in Israel run by the Zionist organization, and also the development of Jerusalem as this important Muslim holy site in the kind of nationalist image, right? Tourism during the Palestine Mandate, started to see that. Kind of the very beginnings almost of birthright, right? But
in a way, totally.
Yeah, Palestinian middle classes, for instance. This is a different article than the one I wanted to talk about, or it's a chapter. But the Palestinian middle classes, largely excluded from political participation, were not able to fashion a national space. Instead, the Supreme Muslim Council established Jerusalem as a symbol of Arab Palestine, whereas Zionist tourism development strategies merged with their territorial ambitions, thereby defining the future nation state. Right, so and you can kind of actually see that today, how Arab Palestine is so symbolized by Jerusalem, and I mean, obviously it is a really important Masjid al-Aqsa, not to diminish its importance or anything, but it's also that kind of thing is partially constructed in the image of a nation, it's so associated in our minds with that, when there's other history in Palestine as well. It's a large. But anyway, this is the article that I wanted to read because it's kind of interesting about this, and it kind of relates to what you're talking about the sort of imperial romanticism and all this stuff. So, framing the Mandate period in the Middle East as post-Ottoman is now common among historians wishing to bring continuities rather than ruptures to the forefront of our understanding of the Middle East in the aftermath of World War I. This article is by Dotan Halevi. Ottoman ruins captured. Antiquities, preservation, and waqf in mandatory Palestine. So anyway, this reading goes against both nationalist and colonial historiographies that aim to disconnect the Ottoman successor states from their Ottoman past. But the question of continuity and rupture in history is not merely a matter of historiographical debate. It is rather a reality that historical actors labor to craft, often through complex mechanisms. This article discusses two such mechanisms: the British Department of Antiquities in Palestine and the Antiquities Ordinance by which it operated. I explored one of the DOA's first preservation projects to demonstrate how the British administration in Palestine aimed to distance itself from its Ottoman predecessor and the Ottoman past, and bind British rule to Christian periods in the history of the land. I argued that to promote this alleged rupture, the British nevertheless had to rely on, and at times capitulate to, legislation, institutions, and norms laid by the Ottomans from the Tanzimat period on. Thus, rather than being two distinct and contradictory ways for contemporaries to understand their relationship to the past, continuity and rupture emerged in post-Ottoman Palestine as co-constitutive. The Mandatory Government of Palestine enacted its Antiquities Ordinance on 15th October 1920, shortly after the establishment of the British civil administration in Palestine. The ordinance's declared goal was to protect antiquities from the theft and damage, and to set strict procedures for archaeological excavations. There was nothing new about state guardianship over antiquities in former Ottoman territories like Palestine, though. An Ottoman antiquities law had been in place in various iterations for more than 4 decades, first enacted in 1869 and revisited in 1874. The Ottoman antiquities law meant to be a measure of protection against formal and informal acquisition of antiquities by European archaeologists, antiquarians, and travelers. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You see today, where it's oh, people only care about antiquities because of, European colonists. It's in a way, once it became necessary to protect them. But in the era of great powers, in the era of great powers, imperialism, safeguarding and possessing its own antiquities was a matter of imperial sovereignty and dignity for the Ottoman Empire. Starting in 1884, starting with the 1884 version of this law, the law was imbued with a sense of historical value, as the empire came to view ancient treasures buried in its soil as proofs of ancestral origins in its territory. Antiquities were defined accordingly as artifacts left by the ancient people who inhabited the Ottoman Empire, and included also ancient structures and ruins. By 1906, the law expanded this already quite inclusive category even further by supplying an open-ended list of examples to what may be regarded as antiquities. This further expansion implied that any type of artifact from the past may be cast as an antiquity. Throughout the last quarter of the 19th century, the Ottoman state displayed its antiquities and sites of historical ruins as spectacles, manifesting imperial grandeur, historical depth, and modern science, thus countering European claims of decline. The Antiquities Law, as part of general imperial interest antiquities, was a cornerstone in the Ottoman quest for European-defined modernity. Despite British claims for a wholesale reform, the defensive spirit of the Antiquities Ordinance in Palestine faithfully mimicked the previous Ottoman law. Taking Palestine as a political unit, the British ruled that antiquities found in Palestine be kept in Jerusalem. They claimed to reverse by this, the Ottomans' practice of removing the land's antiquities to Istanbul, using the very Ottoman measure of antiquities protection to slander their legacy. In this spirit, the British military authorities triumphantly presented piles of ancient artifacts that the Ottomans allegedly abandoned in their retreat from Palestine during the war. Once loyal Ottomans, like the Jewish intellectual Eliezer ben Yehuda, soon started advocating for the repatriation of quote-unquote Palestinian artifacts held in Istanbul. Beyond the discursive realm, however, the British made one significant adaptation to the Ottoman law regarding the very definition of antiquities. Instead of the Ottoman open list, the British Ordinance rules that the term antiquity shall include any object of construction made by human agency earlier than AD 1700. Simply put, the ordinance deprived historical artifacts produced after the year 1700 of state protection. The ramifications of this chronological threshold are crucial for understanding the work of the DOA and its reception of history. The 1700 threshold rendered artifacts and structures from the last 2 centuries of Ottoman rule dispensable. Concurrently, it brought under the authority of the DOA vast numbers of buildings that had foundations erected prior to 1700. Implementing the Antiquities Ordinance upon these buildings meant halting works of repair, reconstruction, or destruction, and replacing them with the much more demanding task of historical preservation. Making visible the subtle association between historical value and political control, the British could now deaden the built landscape through preservation at will. But the novelty in their reading of Palestine's past relics, relying on the Antiquities Ordinance, goes much further. Applying the 1700 threshold allowed the British to recognize the last 2 centuries of Ottoman rule in Palestine only in the material decay of buildings erected earlier, and therefore to identify them as an era of ignorance and neglect. Given the obliviousness to, and at times even physical erasure of, remains from those last 2 centuries, this impression could not have been balanced by studying original Ottoman and Arabic architecture from the 18th and 19th centuries. Within the confines of the British Antiquities Ordinance, remains from these periods could have only interrupted, corrupted, or degraded the, quote, antiquities that preceded them. They became emblems of the alleged Ottoman decline. To demonstrate the point, I discussed the DOA's urge for preserving an occasional ruin in the outskirts of the town of Ramla. The article then turns to examine the opposite historical perceptions of Palestine's Supreme Muslim Council, which emerged as the DOA's unexpected counterpart in its preservation effort. In the encounter between the two bodies and visions, I show the British attempt to create historical rupture resulted in enhancing historical continuity. So, it goes into kind of a case study, but it's a long article. I recommend reading the whole thing, but you can kind of see this kind of goes along with what you were talking about with like the, representation of it as kind of this blighted land, right? We talked about this a little bit before, right. And obviously this period did mark a change in certain ways, right? Like a certain presentation of Palestine now that was fully under British control. But we had talked even about during the Ottoman period, the kind of tourism, the sort of Holy Land tourism that existed. And now they kind of like use their authority to kind of freeze that image. And I think it's a very important point, like the Antiquities Law as a political tool that like prevented people from they gave them control over these buildings that existed that had foundations from before 1700, but also helped to kind of fix this image of these Arabs as being primitive people who were still living in biblical times and who needed the scientific advancement to come in, right?
Well, they kind of like loot and destroy all the more recent shit. I guess they're like allowed to, right? At the same time, or just bulldoze a lot of it and build new shit on top of it, and then all you have left are like these old ruins. And that's some dark archaeology right there.
Yes,
but it makes sense.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time left. One thing that I had highlighted I think most of the stuff that we highlighted we did read. There's one more thing that I think would be good to kind of close us out. I mean, obviously, we could have filled much more time with we have much more stuff, but in terms of my expectations for this episode, I think we covered a fair amount of stuff and kind of like getting into this and setting the stage for the mandate. But there's one other thing that I thought might be good to read. Let me see if I can bring it up. Yeah, here we go. This book, which I had in the list from the very beginning, which is about the Jewish agency in Syria during the Arab revolt in Palestine. Right. So I think we'll draw on this a bit more like when we actually talk about the Arab revolt of 1936, which is the main sort of topic of the book. But he does also give some background info, which is like relevant to the sort of period of the turn of the 1920s. Right. So, I'll start in his first chapter here. Mahmoud Muharreb, the Jewish agency in Syria during the Arab revolt in Palestine, secret meetings and negotiations. So, yeah, we'll learn more about that later on. But I really like this first chapter because I like I like how blunt it is. Two key factors led Zionist leaders to gather and analyze information about the Palestinian people and spy on them. The first was the ongoing Zionist quest to seize as much Arab land as possible, especially from landlords who lived outside Palestine, to build Jewish settlements. To this end, the Zionist leadership established institutions that gathered information on the nature of land ownership in Palestine and their owners. They were interested in their background, whether they were foreigners from outside Palestine or Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Jews, or foreign missions or consulates in Palestine, and dug up information on the owner's economic status, social relations, and the means of pushing them into debt to facilitate blackmail. The second, most dangerous factor in the eyes of Zionists was the growing Arab-Palestinian resistance to the Zionist project, which aimed to turn Palestine into a national home for the Jewish people and expel Palestinians. Espionage on I like this guy, really, he's not like making any kind of pretense of like, the sort of lofty both sidesism. Yeah, he's really okay. Espionage on Palestinians and Arabs was closely interlinked with the Palestinian National Liberation Movement and the pace of its struggle. The more Palestinian national struggle escalated, the greater the Zionist intelligence interest in the Arabs. The aftermath of the 1920 and 1921 uprising and the Barak revolt in 1929, again, we'll talk about these events.
21 and 29.
Yeah, 21 under the MUFTI, which took Zionist leaders by surprise. Zionist espionage activity intensified. It increased with the Palestinian and popular upheaval in the first half of the 1930s, which was accompanied by demonstrations, strikes, sit-ins, the formations of youth organizations and secret societies, and the emergence of Palestinian political parties, and reached unprecedented levels during the Great Arab Revolt. In parallel with the conflict taking place between Palestinians and Zionists and their British backers, another conflict was simmering in the background over Arab public opinion. Both the Palestinian national movement and the Zionist movement struggled to win the attention of the Arab ruling elites of neighboring countries, who shared rule of their countries with French or British colonial powers. Palestine's national struggle drew sympathy from its Arab neighbors, attracting hundreds of young Arabs from across the region who were inspired by national and pan-Arab struggles. The Palestinian cause had become a sore point for Arab elites, prompting the Jewish agency, the JA, to try to get Arab public opinion on their side, win over the elites, and gain their support against the Palestinian Arab national movement. By 1921, with the establishment of the Emirate of Transjordan, Zionist leaders had already taken an interest in establishing relations with Emir Abdullah. During the Great Arab Revolt, the Arab Bureau, the intelligence wing of the JA, worked on solidifying relations with the Emir of Transjordan. In the same period, the JA turned its attention to Syria and Lebanon, which had by then become centers for Palestinian revolutionaries and important support centers for the revolt. Intelligence interest in these countries reached an all-time high after Haj Amin al-Husseini left Palestine following British attempts to arrest him and his asylum in Beirut in 1937. Again, this is someone who we'll have to talk about, maybe relative. Maybe we'll talk about these events in 1921 and 1929 next time, and we'll sort out the question of the MUFTI. Yeah, there might be some more. There might be some other interesting things to talk about in this context. Like I found some very interesting articles on like water policy, land law, and forestry, which I feel like are very like interesting pieces. But maybe we could touch on them briefly and like kind of do this little narrative thing going into those events. But anyways, then he talks about the sort of founding of these Zionist intelligence institutions, right? So the founding of these organizations, they date back to 1918. Before the end of World War I, in April 1918, when Britain, author of the Balfour Declaration, occupied half of Palestine, the Zionist Commission, chaired by Chaim Weizmann, who we talked about before, arrived in Palestine. Weizmann was the rising star of the Zionist movement and became chairman of the Executive Committee of the World Zionist Organization in 1921. The Zionist Commission's task, which Weizmann had created in cooperation with the British government from his headquarters in Britain, was to lead the community of colonial Jewish settlers in Palestine, to represent them before the British authorities, and to work to implement the Balfour Declaration. Weizmann attached the highest importance to intelligence work and espionage on the Arabs and made great efforts in the aftermath of World War I to establish a Zionist intelligence agency in Palestine. After numerous consultations between Weizmann and members of the Zionist Commission in Jerusalem, including Zev Jabodsky, who later founded and led the revisionist movement in Zionism, the Zionist Commission decided at the end of 1918 to establish the Information Bureau, Misrad HaYediot, as a affiliated body. It defined the chief task of this bureau as studying the situation of the Palestinian Arab people by gathering information and espionage. The Bureau's ultimate political objective was to collect information and place it at the disposal of the Zionist Commission in Jerusalem and the Zionist leadership so that they could refute any quote-unquote allegations from British anti-Zionist leaders or figures in the British administration regarding the intensity of Arab resistance to the Balfour Declaration, risking a change in British policy on the declaration. At the time, Jewish immigrants in Palestine had little experience in spying and information gathering. The limited experience they had was confined to the Jewish spy network in Palestine, NILI, N-I-L-I, which had worked for British intelligence against Turkey in the last 2 years of World War I, and to paramilitary organization Hashomer, the Guard, which was set up in 1909 to guard Zionist settlements. The Zionist Commission in Jerusalem appointed Levi Isaac Schneerson, yeah, you might recognize his name, one of the most prominent former activists in the Nilai spying ring, to set up and head the Information Bureau. Upon his appointment, Schneerson recruited informants with experience in clandestine work, many of whom were from the Nili network. He opened the headquarters for the Information Office in Jaffa, where it operated for a short period until the beginning of 1920, when it was moved to Jerusalem. The Information Bureau deployed staff and informants in many parts of Palestine and began monitoring Palestinians. They gathered information about their property and land, the main developments and changes in their rank. They were primarily interested in the Palestinian national movement, which began to organize in the aftermath of World War I, prompting the Bureau to monitor Islamic Christian associations, national conferences, political events, and Arab political and cultural clubs. In its investigation into the Palestinian leadership, the Information Bureau prepared individual cards concerning relevant information on senior Palestinian personalities and leaders, prominent field activists, and group cards for major Palestinian families throughout Palestine. So this is these are the original trading cards, many studies on different areas in Palestine were undertaken, investigating their inhabitants and what they owned. There was also an interest in the Arab tribes in the Negev, in the context of an ambitious program to survey all Palestine, only part of which was completed. The Information Bureau paid particular attention to major landowners, whether they were Palestinian Arabs or Arabs from outside Palestine, digging their weak spots in order to blackmail them. In its first year of operation, 1919, the Information Bureau had a budget of £1,528, appropriated from a fund organized by Weizmann, rather than the budget allocated to the Zionist Commission that set up and supervised the Bureau. Since inception, the Information Bureau provided intelligence services to the British occupation authorities and its various agencies. It translated the news and reports it received concerning Palestinian arms caches or Palestinians wanted by the British occupation authorities and the like into English and submitted them to the Criminal Investigations Department, CID. Shortly after its establishment, and with the escalation in the Palestinian national struggle, the Information Bureau began submitting a weekly report to the Office of the British High Commissioner in Palestine and to the Zionist administration in London, which passed it on to the British Ministry of War. So then he goes on to talk about Chaim Weizmann, a little bit more specifically. Some of the,
blackmailing landowners. Wow. Okay.
Well,
so they're really getting into it like right away.
Yeah.
Damn. Okay.
You gotta be, In February 1920, demonstrations took place in Jerusalem and other Palestinian cities in protest against British pro-Zionist policy and against Zionist activity, seeking to turn Palestine into a national home for Jews. On 1st March 1920, Palestinian gunmen attacked the settlements of Tel Hai and Khafar Galadi in northern Palestine. Palestinian fighters occupied the two settlements and killed 7 Zionist settlers, including Joseph Trumpeldor, a prominent Zionist leader. A week later, Arab-Palestinian demonstrations erupted again after the Syrian Congress's declaration of the independence of Syria within its national borders, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Transjordan, and the investiture of Prince Faisal bin Hussein as king. On 1st April 1920, marches from neighboring Palestinian towns and villages headed to Jerusalem to participate in celebrations to mark the occasion. The celebrations soon turned into demonstrations and clashes with Jewish settlers, which led to many deaths and hundreds of injuries. So this is like, again, in the David Simon narrative,
the riots.
Like, only this matters, none of the British double dealing, none of the incredible deceit, none of the colonial ambitions, and the complete disregard for everyone who lived in Palestine unless they could help set up this advanced, sophisticated Jewish national home that it already committed to because it was right. And by their own, assessment based on basically nothing,
Yeah, none of that's relevant.
Only In mid-March 1920, in an atmosphere fraught with tension, Weizmann visited Palestine, having met with British leadership in Cairo on his way there. Resistance to Zionism and pro-Zionist British policy and prevalent Arab sympathy for the Palestinian struggle against Zionism worried Weizmann, raising concerns about whether Britain would abide by the Balfour Declaration, which stipulated the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In response, he sought to buy and even fake petitions. Yeah, I think some of this was actually mentioned in that one thing, the petition issue, or the documents where you have some Arabs supporting Zionism. No doubt some did. Some, again, we were talking about before.
Maybe the ones that got blackmailed.
Yeah, exactly, Yeah, there may have been some who were but I feel like it was obvious which way these things were going to most people, right? But anyway, and even fake petitions signed by Palestinians can convince the British that the Zionist project could be implemented without harming them and with their consent. Like most Zionist leaders of his time, Weizmann denied the existence of a Palestinian Arab people or of an Arab people in Palestine. He understood that the recognition of the existence of an Arab-Palestinian people necessitated an acknowledgement of their national rights, including the right of self-determination and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, facts which would undermine the entire Zionist project. Weizmann thus rejected the existence of a Palestinian national movement, while at the same time he sought to establish an alternative to the Palestinian national movement leadership, and actively tried to fuel divisions between Palestinian Muslims and Christians, between the inhabitants of cities, villages, and Bedouins, and between families, clans, and communities. Weizmann pressed the Information Bureau for reports and intelligence that would help achieve the Zionist movement's political goals. During his visit to Palestine, which was in revolt against Britain and Zionism, Weizmann toured Palestine in the company of 2 bodyguards, one of whom was Schneerson, head of the Information Bureau. Weizmann instructed Schneerson to wage political warfare among the Palestinian Arabs. He ordered the Information Bureau to pursue 6 objectives: stirring up strife between Arab Christians and Muslims, buying anti-Zionist Arab newspapers and persuading them to support Zionism, buy off notables in the Nablus area to work against the Palestinian national movement active in the city of Nablus, co-opting them by bribes, forgery, or both, to collect petitions calling for a British mandate on Palestine, and also demanding Jewish immigration to Palestine and the establishment of a club as a base for those who supported the collaboration with Zionism, working to form an alliance with tribal sheikhs in Transjordan so as to undermine their relationship with Syria, counteractive support for the Palestinian national movement, and get them to produce quote-unquote petitions in support of Zionism, Jewish immigration, and a British mandate. Seeking to establish relationships with Bedouin sheikhs in the Negev in an attempt to disrupt the relationships developing between them and the leaders of the Palestinian national movement, and finally, establishing joint clubs for Jews and Arabs to spread Zionist ideas and propaganda and to incite against the Palestinian national movement and its leadership. Carrying out Weizmann's request, the Information Bureau arranged a meeting between him and a notable from Nablus, which at the time was playing a leading role in the Palestinian national struggle. Weizmann gave him £1,000 to organize and pay for petitions supportive of Zionism, Jewish immigration, and the British mandate over Palestine. The Information Bureau also invited several sheikhs in Transjordan to meet with Weizmann in Jericho and forge an alliance with Zionism. 10 leading sheikhs responded positively. However, the outbreak of Palestinian demonstrations and clashes between Palestinians and Zionists meant Weizmann never made it to Jericho. The Information Bureau organized another meeting for Weizmann on 6th April at the Rehovot settlement with a number of sheikhs from the Negev. Again, Weizmann was unable to attend the meeting, this time because of clashes in Jerusalem. Expenses for the 2 meetings he failed to attend came to £260, which were dispersed by the Information Bureau in the form of bribes, petty cash, and travel expenses. The Information Bureau expended other large sums to foment discord among Arab Muslims and Christians in Jerusalem and elsewhere in Palestine. as well as 125 pounds to acquire an Arabic newspaper in Jaffa. That is 125 pounds, not any thousand anything. Just a mere 125 pounds to acquire an Arabic newspaper in Jaffa, whose editor was replaced and the paper turned into a Zionist mouthpiece.
That's pretty staggering. All that stuff. I mean, it's pretty comprehensive and sophisticated. It's like COINTELPRO plus like Operation Mockingbird.
Oh
yeah, than that honestly.
It was definitely an Operation Mockingbird type thing, and they did the same in Syria, right? Because Faisal, he was kind of conciliatory, right? As we mentioned, right? He was like more open to it, even though, not sufficiently, I guess. Pellman, who was Weizmann's kind of Dr. Shlomo Pellman, he was, kind of the envoy of Weizmann in Damascus, right? Basically serving as an unofficial representative of the World Zionist Organization, but also just spying, as well. So, Pellman pointed out that, there was criticism of King Faisal that was growing because he was conciliatory towards Zionism. In one of his reports, he suggested that Weizmann buy Syrian newspapers and bribe Syrian newspaper owners, journalists, and activists so as to turn them pro-Zionist. In his open mission, an official representative of Weizmann's Zionist organization to King Faisal in Damascus, Pellman nurtured relations between King Faisal and Weizmann by delivering Weizmann's letters to King Faisal and making contacts. He also held long negotiations with King Faisal on the terms of a loan to be provided by the Zionist organization to Faisal's government, which was in the midst of a severe financial crisis. The political price King Faisal would pay in return was his government's support of Zionist ambitions in Palestine in terms of immigration, settlement, and the creation of a Jewish national home. Ooh. While Pellman was spying at Damascus, Jewish journalist Jacques Kalmi was spying for Weizmann in Beirut. Kalmi began working for Weizmann and the Zionist organization in April 1920 and provided Weizmann with information on the situation in Lebanon and Syria and on French-Arab relations, while working as a liaison between the Zionist Commission in Jerusalem and the French authorities in Lebanon. Weizmann and the Zionist Commission in Jerusalem also made use of some Beiruti Jews as spies, most notably Kalev, a journalist who furnished Weizmann and the Zionist Commission in Jerusalem with information about the positions and coverage of the Syrian press regarding the events in Palestine and developments in Syria. Wow. So, eventually this, this organization was closed down, and the reasons for it were the political institutional conflict within the Jewish settler community in Palestine regarding policy towards the Arabs, over which Zionist bodies should take responsibility in dealing with the, quote, Arab question, the lack of funds given the new financial burdens on the Zionist Commission following increasing Jewish immigration to Palestine and the cost of absorbing new settlers, and the San Remo Conference's approval of the British Mandate for Palestine, the fall of the Faisal government, and the withdrawal of Weizmann, who stopped pumping money into the Information Bureau. But, there were, replacements. In 1922, you had the Jewish National Council in Palestine establishing its Arab Secretariat, which is concerned with the Arab question and anything to do with Zionist policy and intelligence work on Arabs, which was headed by Chaim Kalvarisky. He worked to recruit Arab support for the Zionist project by offering bribes and loans, but his achievements in this respect were very limited. The Arab Secretariat did not last long, primarily because of a shortage of funds and conflict between the two national institutions active in the Jewish settler community in Palestine, the JNC and the Zionist Organization in Jerusalem. These two factors, coupled with the establishment of the British Mandate in 1922 and the return of relative calm, led to the dissolution of the Arab Secretariat in 1923. So, the same year, the political department of the Zionist Executive, known as the Jewish Agency for Palestine for the purposes of the Mandate, in Jerusalem, set up the Arab Bureau, Ha-Lishka Ha-Aravit, to handle intelligence work on Arabs. Frederick Kish headed the JA's political department in Jerusalem from 1922 to 1931. His biography perhaps reveals the extent and the depth of the Zionist-British engagement and alliance. Prior to this, Frederick Kish served in the British Army, including as an intelligence officer in the British mission to the peace conference talks of 1919 to 1921. In 1939, he returned to the British Army and rose to the rank of brigadier. He was killed by a landmine in Tunisia during the Second World War. He did not speak either Arabic or Hebrew, so
Naturally.
he appointed Kalvarisky as director of the Arab Bureau. They led Zionist intelligence and espionage efforts against the Arabs until 1931. It gives some background on Kalvarisky, but anyway, I think they kind of kept up the same thing, right? After the outbreak of the Syrian Revolution in 1925, right, that's sort of against the French Mandate, the Arab press office twice sent Gershon Gronsky, correspondent for the British newspapers The Guardian and Christian Science Monitor, to Syria. During his visits, he met with Syrian leaders and submitted a detailed report to the Arab Bureau and the Zionist leadership. Very interesting. Yeah, they frequently use Zionist journalists working on foreign newspapers to gather information on Arabs. I mean, obviously, as we talked about, like these days, sort of a protocols-esque belief is like fairly popular in the Arab world, and concern about like Jewish infiltration and things like that is like pretty widespread. Mm-hmm. But, and again, that's not justifiable. And as I've said previously in the same series, I think that like that kind of view, that's sort of like insofar as like people like believe in like protocols type stuff, and like the world is run by like a Jewish cabal or something like that, and don't have like an actual reality based like view of the situation, as horrible as it is, I think that is like kind of an impediment to like the movement for Palestinian liberation. However, like one can also, again, not necessarily an excuse, but certainly context for that type of belief, because
they were operating in a like below board, very contrary to the number 1 of the 14 points, which said that diplomacy should always be done in the open, never secret active, which of course is kind of ridiculous. Like it's like obviously nobody's going to follow that, right? But you do see like this extremely active infrastructure being built out, and the worst fears of the Arabs in terms of like Zionist takeover and co-optation of their land like ended up coming true in this way. And like it was clearly in the works for pretty much from the Zionist perspective. I think once the Balfour Declaration was kind of like set in stone and they knew the British weren't going to go back on it, they had this green light, and this like umbrella of military protection and sort of a geopolitical cover from the British to like to start a project that might take like 20 years, and had many different moving pieces, but was going to like transform the region, allow them to straight up take it over. And they're like, it's like they're casing the block, kind of, like that's the vibe of all this, right? Like they're casing the block to see like who has what, like who's gonna stand in our way, like what can we steal, like what's the most valuable shit, what are they saying in Damascus about, what we're doing here. Like they're being very tactical about how they go about this, but they're clearly kind of building an infrastructure to take over. And the British are sure as hell not stopping them, right? Yeah. Contrary to what I hear some people say sometimes, like, the British, like, we're fighting against the Zionists and blah, blah, blah. And
that's like, partially true that there were some who, like, were, there was, like, Zionist terrorism against the British colonial authority because they believed they weren't, like, moving fast enough,
right?
But it's obvious where their sympathies lay and where their, like, plans were leading. They might, like, some may have been impatient. I mean, it really speaks to like the extreme character of some of these like early Zionist groups, that like they were dissatisfied with someone giving them everything that they wanted on a silver platter. Maybe it was unclear to them. Like, I don't know why I'm giving these people like, the benefit of the doubt, but like still, it's just like, yeah.
Well, you kind of even still see it like today, where like the U.S. government is still like patronizing them to like an insane degree. But if you like threaten to pull back like 1%, like in the most performative fake way possible, that isn't really pulling back, like the sort of the right, especially the right wing of Israeli politics, will completely freak out and be like, you want us all to die? Like, how dare you? Like, wow. Like, so there is that kind of aspect of like that radicalism that was there. It's been there for like a century at least.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of that attitude of like the BBC's anti-Semitic or like the New York Times is it's like
I'm quitting the Democrat Party.
Because they're so anti-Semitic.
Like,
exactly.
This anti-Semitism is just outrageous.
Yeah, like the anti-Semitism of the Democrat Party is absolutely out of control. But like, I guess that makes sense. But it's so crazy because it's like, if that is anti-Semitism, like what is like actual anti-Semitism? You know what I mean? Like, like these actual people who are just like straight up like are like, I hate Jews, like I want to kill Jews. Like, then what is that? Like nothing. Like like how do you? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Like it's crazy.
It's kind of a warped. It's definitely a warped POV, and like doesn't.
And
really
what
correspond to...
what more? I guess yeah, I guess if you don't just cheerlead murdering 500,000 kids or whatever, whatever it takes, you know, then for them to feel safe or whatever, even though it's obvious that it's never gonna be enough.
Well, it kind of gets into the psychology of the colonizer and stuff. That,
insane.
You know,
it's just
You could quote a lot of Franz Fanon, about how, in a way, the process of colonization infantilizes the colonizer in a lot of ways. It locks them into this sort of false consciousness that it debases them as well as those who they colonize, right? And I think you could see it in the intentions of these early guys like Weizmann and his lieutenants, and some people that would rise up. I mean, David Ben-Gurion is a young guy at this point. We will get to talk about the sort of paramilitary units, like the Haganah and stuff like that were the Sturm Gang, that later in the 1930s assume a pretty chilling character, but they're already laying this intelligence network, espionage thing, right at the outset of the Mandate, which is very interesting. I'm sure that's going to become very relevant, as the entity that will become Israel starts to sort of coalesce in these upcoming episodes. I think we're going to see that deep state start to congeal, and it is a pretty powerful. I mean, it punches above its weight class, I would say. I also don't think it controls the world, or that Jews control the world or anything like that. And I think that's where people start to get it twisted. And I agree with you. It's not helpful to the overall argument about why this is a fucked up colonial situation to start spiraling on, and especially under the argument of well, they're the bad guys right now, so we should just say bad things about the bad guys. And it's no, because part of their gas comes from, and their public support in the West, or the tolerance of it, comes from also wanting actually a pretty, I'd say good or normal impulse to protect a vulnerable community against these kind of right-wing psychos that think that they literally get together and run the world, and maybe we should just get rid of, it starts sliding into some Hitler shit. And normal people generally think that's weird and they don't like it, and it's it also gives a perfect opportunity for Zionists to smear their critics.
Well, I think a big part of it. I mean, I think a big part of it. I mean, I was thinking more about less so than in the United States, people who think, even though there are people who do think that way in the United States. Certainly, I think I was thinking more in the Arab world, but I also feel a big thing with it is and I think it makes more sense if Israel is right where you live and is all up in your business, it
for sure,
then it it's kind of looms larger. It's less understandable in the US context, even though you do have people in the US who kind of do this, which is what I mean by this is invert the relationship between the United States and Israel. You know what I mean? Where Israel, or understood as Jews in general, are in control of the United States, and that's why
we're
this
Israel's
is happening.
puppet. Yeah,
exactly. But that's
much
not
as
why.
Right.
The thing is, the people in the power in the United States, they're 100% complicit. There's not really too much of a distinction. They could stop them if they wanted to, but they're not they don't want to. They're partners with them.
Yeah,
it's not we're being forced or having our arms twisted or something.
Exactly. We just need to stand up to Bibi.
If they wanted to, they would bring all the banks crashing down or whatever, because they're planning to have a one world some kind of thing like that or whatever.
Right.
It's
I think the way maybe I would describe it is the way we have had special relationships with various countries, whether it's the UK, whether it's Liberia, whatever, a country with a few similarities there. We have a toxic special relationship with Israel. We are in a toxic special relationship with them, but we are the dominant partner in that, right? And
they're topping from the bottom. They're topping from the bottom.
They're bratty subs. They're bratty subs.
Yeah.
They're bratty bottoms.
Yeah.
Kind of. I mean, like in a way, like, but they're not like really in control in a way where like, oh, we just can't do anything about it because like they. And I
No,
think it's like
that's absolutely not
it's
true.
like an
Like,
error to think.
It's interesting, and like, there's subtleties to it because I think that like it depends on what your definition of can't is. Because I think that maybe in Joe Biden's mind or something like that, someone like that, or in Anthony Blinken's mind, he can't do anything. Because for him, the end of can't is like being mean to Netanyahu or something, or like cutting off aid to our precious Israel,
Yeah, turning your back on Israel.
But he really believes that, like, they really believe that, and they really like have that commitment to it. No one's gonna condition or like cut aid to Israel, which is what you need to do, to even get a slight concession, right? Like I think and a lot of people on the left kind of have this vision of like, oh, like a one state solution is like the goal, but like everything that we do with BDS and stuff like that, like even to get like the bare minimum, even to get like this like a recognition from people like Netanyahu of the legitimacy of like a Palestinian state at all.
Right.
Like I mean like this, it's just like anything to get anything, and like to even get an end to this nightmare that's currently happening, like pressure needs to be applied.
To cut the money off directly.
That's what we're
from the
trying to
source
do with our
the
boycotts,
weapons.
and which extends to like academic boycotts. Like I know some people like don't like that but that's the thing. You have to like nothing. Like you can't just be like, oh, it's sad, and then like not do anything, which is like how our government kind of acts and how people kind of like act towards the government. Where like, oh, we like, okay, well, they don't want to do anything, but like we're trying to pressure them a little bit or something. Like but we're still gonna vote for them because Drumpf or something,
Right.
So
it's a depressing situation because like the sort of the masses of people really don't have like a ton of leverage to get the government to like do that because everyone's like a Zionist,
Scared
like
of
in
Trump.
both parties. That said,
true.
if you're
Everyone's a Zionist in both parties,
if you're gonna target anything, might as well go for the big one, like the big bag, like the money that we send them, like the military aid, the weapons, like everything else, like go after that. And because that's the kind of thing that
would it be so crazy for like that's the thing, like why is it so crazy for Kamala or someone, just in general, like an American like liberal politician to say like we're not going to give you like this much money if you keep doing this because it's evil. Like it's everyone in the world agrees.
Yeah, it's actually a little strange because like as we discovered a number of episodes back, we were looking into like George H.W. Bush's opinion about like Israel, and we found that like he actually like at least threatened in the early 90s to reduce their aid if they didn't stop like building settlements in the West Bank. And he had like a little bit of like a back and forth with them about like various shit. And I feel like that used to not be, it's like we always are going to be their best friend at the end of the day. But like sometimes presidents would at least like try to exercise some kind of leverage like with the purse strings. But now it's just like, no, we have to just give them it. I don't know. The relationship that American politicians also have now with money is like extremely toxic and like detached from reality, I think, of like maybe it's decades of living in kind of unchained like fiat currency, just like unipolar empire kind of mindset. But I mean, the amount of money that like I think they dump on Israel right now, like nobody even really thinks about like, oh, it's like a lot of money.
It's a weird thing because like what's very strange about it like is that I mean, we like if it would be helpful for people, we can definitely talk about like what was strategic, particularly about controlling Palestine for the British. Like we talked about the Suez Canal and all these things, right? And also like we talked about previously the access. We can go into that more deeply as part of our discussion of like the Mandate, like interwar period. But like also like nowadays. I had a friend ask me this, and like again, I'm not like the geopolitical expert, and it does have that access to like the the Eastern Mediterranean, which is unique, but the US does have like powerful like allies and bases like in Saudi, for instance. We have like the Gulf states. Maybe they're not as like we don't see them as reliable allies, but like it is weird how like we have this incredible I mean, I guess it's a moot point because it's not like Saudi's interests are necessarily not aligned with Israel's at this point, because they'll just like bend the knee and go along with anything. But it is, I mean, I think like a lot of it is like this kind of accrued like belief and this accrued kind of like ideological commitment that sometimes does in some ways. Again, like there definitely is geopolitical utility to having, like, you know, as Joe Biden said, if Israel didn't exist, we had to invent it. That's how valuable it is. Right. But also, like, there is this kind of like ideological investment, you know, and like the thing is like and I think this is kind of like true. You know, it's kind of a weird analogy, but like when I read this, I think, you know, from the point of view of like being a Muslim and like, you know, like feeling like, you know, like wishing that things had gone another way, or that like there had been some kind of way to resist this, you know, and like my sympathy with Arabs and Muslims, like I'm thinking like, where was our intelligence agency, you know, like that's what the thoughts going through my mind. And that's like what I see sometimes, like, where's our APAC?
For Muslims,
or for Palestinians or for Arabs or whatever, you know, like
Well, that is something that comes up like every
I'm sure
time.
Like there is like an Arab American action committee or like whatever, but it's not nearly as powerful, you know. And it's not like CARE
and a couple other orgs like that. Yeah, but nothing on the
not
same
really
juice.
The same thing. Yeah, like, exactly. Like where like it's not like every single member of Congress has like someone who's like assigned from CARE to like come give them a presentation on like how important, like how evil the Zionists are, you know, which is basically the equivalent of what AIPAC does, except it's how evil the Palestinians are. You know?
Right.
Like, how come we don't get to give them a presentation? You know,
it's kind of an interesting question, especially given like the oil monarchies that we're like very closely allied with, who kind of like publicly gesture at being like pro-Palestine, and sometimes are kind of like, you know, like Qatar often plays like a mediator role or something like that. But they're definitely not. I feel like, you know, they're not exactly like showering, you know, Congress people with money to like get them to like change their policy about Israel for whatever reason. But also like the Zionists, like going back to the 1890s, always, you know, a few different books have cited this, of like the aptitude of their PR game was always high, and they always had an edge over the Arabs in regards to that. And I would say like up to this day, like they absolutely, there's new challenges with like TikTok now, where when you see direct videos of like blown up children that like Palestinians are posting, you know, it's pretty hard to spin that. But in terms of like legacy media, and even a lot of like quote unquote, you know, new or alternative media, like they've got a lot of I don't know, like they control everything, but like they have a lot of bases covered, you know. Like Alex Jones never actually like goes in on Israel. I used to think that's because he wanted to differentiate himself from like Zog, like anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists, but
it's because he hates Muslims more, which is true. I think of most people like that, you know, like when like what we saw with when October 7th happened, all these like base dissidents were like, you know, go Israel, like kill those Muslims, you know, because they you know, they hate Muslims more.
And I think at the end of it, despite all of its like liberal kind of gesturing about how like you can be gay in like Tel Aviv but not Gaza or whatever, I think that, you know, Israel still has to, at least on a subconscious level, like it's sort of the last like great like colony of like the West in like another region that like carved itself out and built like a based Western society, and kind of like polices it through like an advanced military and all this other shit, but also like loves go psytrance and like drugs and partying and just like chill, bro. And like they're just like us for real, you know, like,
and
in
you
that
can go on a vacation
way.
there and like ride on a camel and like do drugs, and like it's awesome.
Yeah,
you know, like you couldn't do that in a democratic Palestine because they'd be mad.
Yeah, they'd be mad about it or something.
Abetted a genocide for years and years. Like, yeah, but it's like, I don't know. I almost feel like
they're us, so we have to defend.
The other
like,
thing
we
is,
have to
and
keep defending them. And
I will say, like
them.
Shadi Hamid, you know, I think I've said this before. Like giving him, this is the one point I give him like credit on, you know, or like maybe not the one point. You know, he's had some other points maybe, but like, you know, he has also had points where I'm just like, this is so stupid. But you know, he's really like a real hit or miss guy. And this I think was a hit, which is a great point, which is that think about those Gulf countries and think about what their governments are like. They're monarchies. And like, to go back to the point you made about Faisal, like, I think that on a certain level, like, people like Faisal feel the same way about their own people, the way that T.E. Lawrence felt about Faisal. Like, I'm better than them. And like, they are a threat to me, and they just need to stay down, you know? Like, they need to just like, and like, what I want is like money, and like to be a baller, and to be like these, you know, these Americans, and like to have this picture of Jesus in my house, and you know,
Bandar Bush, like,
to build a
owning
giant
the Dallas
mall in the
Cowboys.
desert.
Like,
yeah, exactly. And like,
I mean, it's that comprador spirit, isn't it? You know,
exactly. And they, so like, they don't like, you know, the people. Like, they don't want to piss at the people too much. They're gonna try to signal like, oh, I oppose Israel, but they don't really care. So that's like what I think. You know, they don't really care. They care insofar as like it might outrage. Like, they need to keep, like, they need to do a delicate balancing act between just like brutally repressing anyone who would be a threat to them, and also like kind of doing token gestures to like appease the, you know, the population. But like, if those places were democracies, you would never have the Abraham Accords. And that was Shadi Hamid's point.
Like, it's obviously not the will of the
only
people.
monarchies that you have that shit, you know?
Yeah, but then they're, you know, like, they're chill at the end of the day. Like, you know, capital flows in and out, and they sell their oil, and like, they're not a big deal. But then you start talking about Palestinians having like a democratic state or something, and it's like, whoa, that's too dangerous. I don't know. It's bullshit.
At this point, like, I think it was Walid Khalidi. Like, there's a lot of people who are like, you know, a lot of like Palestinian intellectuals, I think, or maybe not a lot, but like a couple of Palestinian intellectuals who like are very much like, you know, anti-Zionist, very much like involved in the Palestinian liberation movement, who are still like controversial because they like, you know, have like different stances from like the broad, you know, your standard like kind of line on things, like, which is like one state, you know. I think it was Walid Khalidi who wrote this. Let me confirm that it is that I'm not misrepresenting. Yeah, it's Walid Khalidi. Yeah, I mean, he said something that was like, you know, he's like professing like, I'm a two-stater, you know, I believe in a two-state solution because we already had a one-state solution that was called the British Mandate, and we saw like how that worked out, you know.
Right.
But like, honestly, like, even that, like, that would be like something. Again, I feel like the way something needs to be done about the way like Israel is, because like, it doesn't matter. Like, for instance, God forbid, like, let's say that like they succeed in just like completely eliminating all Palestinians from, like, you know, if they get there from the river to the sea vision, and just like get every single, like, go to Jordan, go to Egypt, blah blah, like, they're all gone, and like everyone just settles and moves in, and it's all Israel.
Yeah.
Are they gonna stop there?
Well, then they're still surrounded by Arabs, and they've just done,
and they're still in danger, you know.
Well,
like, there's still these like, and probably those Arabs might be a little bit pissed off, and there's Palestinians there now, actually, because they've all been expelled.
Because you can't kill them all, even though
so they're kind of right on the borders of Israel, you know. So,
and Iran is still there, and Hezbollah is still there. I mean, none of that happens. So
that's
in a
the thing.
vacuum,
like, once you like, if you just keep like appeasing like that mentality, like, it doesn't just like stop when they get what they currently mainly want, you know. Like, if you like, I'm sure that like how big was like Judea in the Bible? You know, I'm
smaller than Israel. It's, I think, it's like a portion of Israel, like, right? It's
really? It's smaller? I was thinking that it would be bigger, and that they would like, you know, turn to that and be like, oh, you know,
I think Netanyahu
have
definitely
a right to like Lebanon.
No,
right
they
to,
have a weird. Sometimes,
you know,
everybody gets accused of having a greater fill in the blank, like Charles Taylor got accused of having Greater Liberia, Milosevic got accused of Greater Serbia. But I think in the case of like Netanyahu and Likud, like, they are about that Greater Israel shit, and I think they probably have their little maps and their little dreams about like what, and like biblical, like twisted biblical arguments about
in Genesis 15:18, God says to Abram, who had just arrived in Canaan. I'm reading this from gotquestions.org. To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. The whole land of Canaan I give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you. So
you have I'm sure there are some like
all of Canaan,
scholars
from Egypt to modern day Iraq.
I'm sure that IDF rabbi has like
exactly,
been like,
yeah,
that's
like,
what it says, like, that's scripture, and I'm sure there's some fucking Christian Zionists
like,
that are like, there it is, like,
yeah.
You know, so
Well,
and
that'll
would,
probably become the new thing, like when they if they airlift Al-Aqsa Mosque to Saudi, like as part of the Abraham Accords too, which is like what I like, rather than just like blowing it up, like they'll probably like move, like it'll be the new antiquities thing of like moving it to like, you know, MBS's like giant museum in the desert or something. And like, you know, one chamber of his massive like desert mall. This is like a dystopian scenario. Inshallah, like nothing like that will ever happen, you know.
Yeah, living in his Elon Musk bubble city, like biodomes.
Yeah, but you know, like that's the thing. Like that will become the new thing. Like they'll be like, oh, well, why hasn't Jesus come back yet? Oh, I guess it's because they actually haven't taken over the whole biblical land of Canaan from the Nile River to the Euphrates. Like
the types of people on like Team Zionist are like there's not a lot of speed bumps to like stop them from thinking in that way, especially if you know scary Iran is still lurking out there. And I feel like, you know, we're still recording this in the awkward several week like sort of a interlude between the the assassinations we're still waiting of, you know, the Israeli assassinations in Iran. And like Iran's potential response, which
retaliations,
it's retaliation, and then all these kind of peace talks that Antony Blinken is trying to hash out, but doesn't seem to be very sincere. And you know, things could pop off, and I guess like, you know, people might not let Israel like go that far. Or I don't know. I mean, a lot of things could happen.
We'll see. Like, that's the thing. Like, to bring it back around, that's like what, you know, what in this mandate period, like, that's basically what you start to see is like but before that, there were like other like potentialities of history. Like, there's like, you know, a little bit of like glimmers of them here of like different ways things could go. But like, it just starts snowballing. Again, like, I don't want to like set up like this totally teleological historical narrative that's like very linear and simplistic, but with that caveat, it starts snowballing.
Yeah,
like
no,
the
this
appeasement and like the bloodthirst and like the eliminationist like urge just starts really snowballing once you get into this phase.
There's a convergence of powerful forces that like start to make this like attainable for, you know, people that maybe had just like the Zionists who maybe had just dreamed about it. As, like,
you can really see it in those chapters of like Policy of Deceit, like when they're just like, of course not. Like, what? The people like determining anything? Like, no, we know it's going to happen because it is right. Like, that is like the on top, you know, where it's just like, it is like, they just start saying it is right that this happen. It is right. It is proper. Like, like it is age old or whatever. It's like, you just made it up 5 minutes ago, but now it is simply how it is, you know?
Well, anyway. You know, that is the on top. Like, as I remember when, you know, the VP not pick, Josh Shapiro, was like defending the sort of like anti-Palestinian op-ed he wrote when I was 20. I was 20, you know, like he was doing that whole thing. And then he says some kind of like very vague, like mealy mouth thing about like, I have been for a two-state solution for decades. And like, he's like, look, I want all parties to like come together and like, look, this is a conflict that has raged, you know, some would say for thousands of years. And like, it's not going to be easy to solve it. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, flag on the field. Like, no, that's not, like, that's an on top. Like, that's not true. It has not raged for thousands of years. This happened in the 20th century for the most part. Like, this is actually a very
thing
recent
of like
conflict.
They could never cooperate to govern themselves. Like,
no, it's there goes the ancient hatred on top. They pull it out every time. It's just ancient hatreds. Like, these are just tribes and they just hate each other. They're just gonna kill each other. We certainly are not like stoking it or encouraging it or like kind of like a
they certainly weren't
kind
afraid to meet with them and offer them like a $1,000 bribe to support them, or sorry, £1,000 bribe to support them. Like, if they truly anciently hated them, they'd be like, no, I'm gonna kill you for like, how dare you ask me to betray my ancient
infidel. No.
Exactly.
I mean, that's ridiculous. But we'll pick up the when the mandate really starts popping, we'll pick up next time.
Yeah, we'll talk about the events of 21 and 29.
29.
Maybe we'll focus on 21, and you know, maybe we'll talk about 25 and some of that stuff. But yeah, you know, what happened under the MUFTI. It might be good to like read a little bit of like some stuff, like contextualizing the figure of the MUFTI, just because he looms so large.
We
kind of like
could
with
do
Herzl,
a MUFTI deep dive. But
you
when
know,
does he
like
get installed as
so
MUFTI?
Large.
When does he get installed as MUFTI?
He was MUFTI, I think it was like 1922 when he actually took over as MUFTI. I want to
Okay,
say.
well, yeah,
So like, even though he gets
get into
blamed for
him.
1921, I think that he wasn't actually Mufti until then. But I could be wrong. But it was around that time. It was and I think he insisted on the title of Grand Mufti, which like had not previously existed and was just like created. But of course, it's like represented as like the
He's
ancient
the commander of all
role
Muslims.
of Mufti. Yeah, exactly. That
He's
all
literally the commander of all Muslims.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll unpack that. We'll unhistoricize that next time. But until then, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
اعتراض ما رو هم برمی‌گردیم. ما هم سوال می‌کنیم از ما. آقا حضور نیروهای فشار حضور این نیروهای فشار یعنی مدیر مخفیات نیست. در طول این سالها منتشر شده. مثلا در این مقاله من فکر نمی کنم فحشی تو فرهنگ فحش وجود داشته باشه که این آقا به ما نرده باشه. خیلی برخوش هست وجود داره. عباس من میدانستم که تو قالتاق‌ترین نویسنده این مملکت. یکی از مسائل خیلی مهم بوده که روزنامه‌ها خیلی راحت با کلمه که عباس آمریکایی عباس معروفی لیبرال یا آزادی دیدنده‌وار می‌خواد و فلان شروع کردن به تحقیق کردن یه سری از مردم. گروه‌های فشاری وجود دارن که به هر حال توی جامعه هستن کاری هم بهش می‌کنن.